The Committee on Natural Resources will come to order. Today, the committee is meeting to hear testimony today and the 30th of October on the draft bill on the amendments to the Promesa Act of 2019. Under committee rules, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all of the members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 o'clock today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Let me begin with my statement. We're here today to begin the first of 2 days of hearings on the legislation to make changes to Promesa, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act. Today, we will hear from witnesses representing the governor and the legislature of Puerto Rico, as well as the Oversight Board and the municipality of San Juan. Next week, at the second hearing, we will hear from nonprofit organizations and representatives of labor and the private sector. Many of you have heard me say that when Congress drafted and passed Promesa, Democrats would have written a different law if we were in the majority. I believe then, and still do today, the Promesa relies too heavily on austerity measures, falling on the backs of ordinary Puerto Ricanos to achieve the goals of debt reduction and balanced budget. In this regard, the amendments to Promesa that are contained in the draft that we will be discussing today deal with that. The draft bill includes provisions to improve Promesa's implementation by defining essential public services, assigning federal funding for the operation of the Oversight Board, reducing conflicts of interest, and auditing the public debt, among other policy priorities. It also includes provisions to address Puerto Rico's disaster recovery challenges. The purpose of today's hearing, as well as the one next week, is to receive feedback from all the stakeholders on the draft provisions. As a result, I want to encourage anyone who is not able to be a witness at either hearing to submit comments for the record. We want to hear from all interested parties. We are not under any illusion that what we have proposed is the best way to address the challenges the people of Puerto Rico are facing because of the implementation of Promesa or the recovery from Hurricane Maria, and we welcome all those suggestions to improve this draft bill. We've already received numerous comments, both in favor and strongly opposed to some of the provisions in the draft. You will hear many of those comments from our witnesses today. However, I want to caution those who raise objections to the way we are proposing to limit austerity measures to also offer alternatives to accomplishing this goal. I plan on doing all that I can to prevent the Oversight Board from using the existing provisions of Promesa as an excuse to cause further suffering to the residents of Puerto Rico. It is already the view of many that current policies contained in several fiscal plans and annual budgets will result in more social polarization, unemployment, extreme poverty, and lower educational levels in Puerto Rico. The draft bill also includes 2 coordinator provisions for PREPA and the overall disaster recovery of the island that have received significant opposition. Our goal in proposing these provisions was to eliminate concerns which have led to severe delays in the release of recovery funds. Those concerns center around Puerto Rico's ability or inability to manage billions of federal disaster funds in a transparent and open manner. To address these concerns, we propose using practices that were utilized during Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy recoveries. We also provide an opportunity for municipalities and community organizations to have input into recovery plans and decisions in response to criticism that they had been shut out. As the objections to our proposals for reversing austerity measures and increasing transparency, we also expect to hear alternatives to achieving our objective of expediting the release of federal disaster funds and increasing participation in the recovery effort. In closing, I want to welcome our witnesses, thank them for traveling all the way from Puerto Rico to be with us today. I look forward to receiving your testimony and continuing to work with each of you in improving the lives of the people you represent and the ordinary people of Puerto Rico. Like I said, this is a draft discussion. The legislation and the provisions are intended to be draft. They're intended to have feedback. They're intended for the discussion of the members of this committee to also raise their concerns, offer alternatives, and as we go forward, leading to a potential markup, those issues will become more and more prominent as we head toward the finalization of a piece of legislation. I want to thank you again, and I want to now yield to the ranking member, Ms. Colon. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the witnesses, for coming here today. I think the first thing we should be looking today, examining the draft legislation to amend the Puerto Rico Oversight Board Management, better known as Promesa. This bill was enacted in 2016. I remember I was a minority leader at the time in the Puerto Rico House of Representatives, and I opposed this bill. Exactly for two major reasons. First, it gave a federally appointed board power over elected officials of a jurisdiction of more than 3 million Americans living on the island that has no votes in the federal government other than the votes that I have in a few committees in the House and now in the amendment process in the floor. No other control board was named by officials or whom the people could not vote. The members of the board are very capable and should be greatly appreciated for their unpaid service. But again, it is as undemocratic as can be. Relatedly, Promesa premise was that Americans of Puerto Rico were solely to blame for the territory deficit and debt. And I could not sponsor that premise. There was no recognition that our area of the U.S. was underdeveloped and in the economic decline because of its unincorporated territory status, a status that has denied our islands the economic benefits of equal treatment in federal laws and votes in those making those laws. That there does not appear to be in the same interest among the key leaders in improving Promesa as there were in the past in passing it and in somewhat late in the process, but we should give it a try. For that reason, I will not decide how until we hear or witness today, but I have this initial inclination. First, I truly believe that we should have a realistic effort to amend Promesa that requires a broad bipartisan and bicameral support. That was the way it was done in 2016. We should do the same thing now. For instance, the draft includes different kind of controversial proposals regarding the debt. But in the other way, I should support, and I support provisions that are worth exploring. For example, the bill seeks to define essential services to include public safety, healthcare, education, and pensions. It also incorporates language from H.R. 683, bipartisan legislation introduced by Congresswoman Velazquez, and I am a co-sponsor of that bill, that would encourage increased disclosure requirements for persons employed by the Oversight Board to diminish potential conflicts of interest. And I will always support measures that lead to more transparency and accountability as well. On the other hand, the draft provision also established a Reconstruction Coordinator for Puerto Rico and a Revitalization Coordinator for PREPA. In the past, I've been supporting and advocating for a federal coordinator that could work with various federal agencies as a liaison to facilitate and access this and speed up the disbursement of disaster funds for the island. And that's the main issue. We approve the money, but still now, a lot of local agencies and federal agencies are not getting to accord to get that money down there. And as currently drafted, the Office of Reconstruction Coordinator will simply add more bureaucratic layers to the process, and that's the main question. This coordinator will likewise disrupt ongoing effort to transform our energy system and restructure the public corporation finances. I believe we should also have a more in-depth discussion regarding the purpose and intent of the Infrastructure Revitalization Coordinator established by Title V of Promesa before we move forward to eliminate it as the draft bill proposed. There are several issues that I do support. There are many others that we should have a more in-depth discussion. Additionally, we must recognize that solving Puerto Rico fiscal and economic problems requires that we ultimately address the root of our problems, or unequal territorial status. Only through statehood we will be able to acquire the necessary tools to grow our economy and ensure our island's 3.2 million Americans are being treated equally. I look forward to hearing today's witnesses, and I thank you. And before yielding back, I do want to introduce for the record the statement from the University of Puerto Rico President, Dr. Jorge Haddock, as well as our ranking member of this committee, Rob Bishop.
Let me now invite our first panel. Under committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, and your entire statement will be made part of the record as submitted. The lights go from green to yellow, and then it's over. Your time will have, and then that will give us enough time to follow up to the members that are here with any questions that they might have for you. Let me begin with Mr. Omar Marrero, Executive Director, Puerto Rico Fiscal Agency and Financial Advisory Authority. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Chairman Grijalba, Ranking Member Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez, and members of the committee, it is a pleasure to be back in front of you. Governor Vasquez regrets that she was not able to attend today because of a critical meeting with the U.S. Department of Education to address, among other items, the freeze of more than $1.5 billion in federal funding earmarked for Puerto Rico's public education system. The governor asked me to attend today to provide the administration's perspective on the proposed amendments to Promesa. As you know, I serve as Chief Financial Officer for the government of Puerto Rico and Executive Director of the Puerto Rico Fiscal Agency and Financial Advisory Authority. In addition, I would like to introduce Elidia Satienza, the ex-officio member to the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, who is attending with me today. Since taking office on August 7, 2019, Governor Vasquez has made it a top priority to use the tools provided in Promesa to advance the interests of the people of Puerto Rico. To that end, we have worked to establish a more collaborative relationship with the Oversight Board. We prioritize moving the debt restructurings forward and meeting with various agencies and instrumentalities of the government in order to implement structural reforms and transparency within the government. Our administration is fully committed to making progress for the benefit of the people of Puerto Rico. We owe it to them. With regard to the proposed amendments to Promesa, the written statement submitted sets forth the governor's position of each of the amendments. However, I would like to highlight a few of those positions here. First, the proposed amendments related to territorial relief for unsecured public debt. While the proposed amendments may seem underfaced to assist territories in relieving debt burden, we believe the effect of the proposed amendments will be detrimental to Puerto Rico. Instead of being able to fully access the bond markets in the future, we will be limited to only the least optimal mechanism for funding future projects, such as secure or high-interest bonds. It would also make our restructuring more challenging and likely prolong the existence of the Oversight Board. And with all due respect, we just want to get it done and terminate the Oversight Board role in Puerto Rico. Second, we would like to address the proposed amendments that will create additional bureaucracy in the form of a Public Credit Comprehensive Audit Commission, an Office of Reconstruction Coordinator, and a Revitalization Coordinator for PREPA. These functions are either unnecessary or are already being addressed by the government of Puerto Rico and or the Oversight Board. Specifically, first, there's no need for Public Credit Comprehensive Audit Commission because the Oversight Board has already completed and published a comprehensive audit of Puerto Rico's debt and commenced litigation as a result thereof. Nor is such commission necessary to address future debt obligations, as we are working with the Oversight Board to incorporate certain debt management policies into the Title III Plan of Adjustment. We want to make sure that the practice that took Puerto Rico to where we are today, that they don't happen again. And we will make sure that doesn't happen again. Similarly, the Office of Reconstruction Coordinator is unnecessary because the challenge Puerto Rico faces is accessing federal funding sources, no management of use of recovery funds. As required by the federal government, Puerto Rico established Accord 3 as a centralized oversight authority to manage and oversee disaster funding, hired third-party experts with global disaster experience to implement best practices, and implemented transparency measures, including without limitation, a portal that provides detailed information about the uses of federal recovery fundings provided to the island. No other jurisdiction in the U.S. history has come up with such transparency measures. Again, any amendment to Promesa should be focused on centralized coordination at the federal level. Our one option is to really empower the Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator to direct and liaise with the various federal agencies to assist the Puerto Rico government in accessing federal funding sources. Because as Congresswoman Gonzalez just mentioned, we need the close coordination at the federal level. Finally, a revitalization coordinator for PREPA is unnecessary and could be damaging to the ongoing transformation process. The government of Puerto Rico and the Oversight Board are working together to bring private management to the transmission and distribution system, encouraging private investment in the building of new generation, and creating a strong and predictable regulator. We have made substantial progress toward that effort and are hoping to select a counterparty and begin implementation of the transaction in early 2020. Appointing a coordinator for PREPA will be disruptive to the ongoing process and could damage Puerto Rico's overall recovery. In closing, on behalf of the Governor, I would like to express our continued appreciation for the efforts of the committee to make Promesa a more effective law that can better meet the needs of the people of Puerto Rico. Congress and the members of this committee have been always been great friends of Puerto Rico, and we look forward to that continued partnership as well. I'm happy to take your questions, sir.
Thank you. And please, sir, if you don't mind extending the appreciation of the committee to the governor. We understand that by her presence not here, her meeting relative to the education issue is of utmost importance, and while we miss her presentation, we understand the priority. So appreciate it very much.
Yes, sir.
Let me now introduce Ms. Natalie Jarsko, Executive Director, Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. Floor is yours.
Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Congresswoman Gonzalez, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to update the committee on the board's work on behalf of the people of Puerto Rico. I have submitted written testimony for the record and look forward to your questions. In 2016, Congress passed Promesa in a bipartisan manner. While we could all think of ways of improving compromise legislation such as this, the fact is Promesa is working. Together with the new governor, Wanda Vazquez, and her administration, the Bipartisan Oversight Board is making substantial progress on restructuring Puerto Rico's debt and is continuing to improve fiscal responsibility and management on the island. Last month, the board filed its proposed plan of adjustment to restructure $35 billion of debt and other claims against the Commonwealth, the Public Buildings Authority, and the Employment Retirement System, and more than $50 billion of unfunded pension liabilities. That plan reduces $35 billion in Commonwealth liabilities to $12 billion. That plan limits the annual maximum debt service from $4.2 billion to an annual $1.5 billion. That plan keeps debt service to a sustainable level of less than 9% of government-owned source revenue compared to 28% prior to Promesa. It creates a debt management policy to ensure that Puerto Rico never again finds itself in this position. It provides that 74% of current and future pensions are not cut. And it establishes a multi-billion-dollar trust to support the payment of pensions for the next 30 years. It restores $1.3 billion of mandatory employee contributions that no longer exist, and assumes new collective bargaining agreements with public sector unions to give them predictability and certainty. In sum, this plan represents a series of compromises on the part of various stakeholders who all recognize the need to give Puerto Rico a fresh start. Together with COFINA, GDB, PREPA, and PRASA, we are finally moving forward with restructuring most of Puerto Rico's debt. In addition to restructuring this immense debt load, Promesa charges the board with helping Puerto Rico to achieve fiscal sustainability. And to do this, Puerto Rico must focus its efforts on implementing structural reforms to improve the economy's competitiveness, managing its scarce funds more efficiently, consolidating the government agencies that exist, and attracting high-quality managers to a smaller, better-managed government. If spending alone was the answer, the decades of excessive spending that led to this accumulation of debt would have left Puerto Rico with efficient infrastructure and robust government services. But it did not. That's because it's not just the amount of spending that matters, but how efficiently it's spent. For example, just last year, the Department of Education in Puerto Rico underspent $56 million of its budget, despite the need to improve educational outcomes. The Department of Corrections left $22 million unspent, despite clear needs at adult and juvenile facilities. At the Police Bureau, $35.8 million went unspent, despite clear needs for investment in personnel and more and newer equipment. At the Highway and Transportation Authority last year, only 30% of available funds for investment into roads was used, despite the overwhelming need for repair. As I stated at the beginning, Promesa is working. Having said that, we agree that certain parts of the discussion draft would improve Promesa. For example, the proposed provision authored by Representative Velasquez to expand certain disclosure requirements for professionals in the Title III case would be effective at avoiding conflicts of interest and creating greater transparency. On the other hand, as my colleague has noted, the board is concerned that other parts of the discussion draft, while well-intentioned, could compromise the board's ability to fulfill its mandate under Promesa. For example, the unsecured debt discharge language may make it harder and more expensive for the board to restructure Puerto Rico's debt. The provision on essential services could have the opposite of its intended effect because it provides ammunition to those arguing and litigating that the board should be limited to funding only those services that are truly essential and only at the bare minimum. Finally, installing a federal revitalization coordinator for PREPA would disrupt the transformation of the energy sector, which is well underway. The recently filed proposed plan of adjustment and ongoing work restoring fiscal responsibility and management have brought us substantially closer to satisfying the conditions that Promesa establishes for termination of this oversight board. Rather than focusing on changes to Promesa, we remain committed to working with the government to fulfill the mandates of Promesa so that Puerto Rico can reach its real potential, where businesses can have the confidence they need to invest, and the people of Puerto Rico can live in a vibrant and sustainable economy. Thank you.
The ranking member. Mr. Marrero, the people of Puerto Rico are looking for some signal that their government is looking out for their interests. And is that complicit with the oversight board in imposing further hardships on them? So when we hear of the opposition of the administration to the provisions of the discussion draft that they perceive as beneficial to their interests, the people in the public in general, such as defining essential services, doing the audit of the debt, that adds to the cynicism that's out there. They feel that Promesa, and I heard that, and members that have visited have heard that, and the oversight board is working against them. How do you respond to that concern that there is no independent auditing transparency process that's going on, and the cynicism rises?
Oh, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, as to the audit, as an accountant, I can tell you that an audit can take many forms. So I think that the most important part is the fact that the people of Puerto Rico would like to know if some of the issuance of debt was invalid, was illegal, or if there's debt that it was illegally incurred, what are the rights and remedies for that? That is addressed in the 600-page report that the Oversight Board released in August 2018. It delineates specifically what happened and what many administrations did: deficit financing, scoop and tax financing, only interest financing, no amortization principal, and many others. That report, it is there. It was done by an international law firm specialized in this. However, and we are, by the way, and we are already, and the Oversight Board is already invalidating or questioning the legality of several issues, including over $6 billion of general obligations. So that's part of the process. If there's anyone or any interest party that would like to audit or examine the closing binder for the issuance of that to Puerto Rico, they are available. They can come to a FAF, they can get a copy of that. Actually, we are working in order to digitalize that and make it available to the entire people of Puerto Rico. However, we are already 3 years into this game. We have already restructured over $23 billion. Our concern is that an audit or a comprehensive audit done by a new body, a new entity, how are going to be chosen? That will take time, sir, and it will take years. And our specific objective is to comply with Promesa and get out of bankruptcy as soon as possible, because that's the only way that the people of Puerto Rico will be better off. If we exit bankruptcy...
Okay, let me follow up. HUD recently told members of the House Appropriations Subcommittee that the department had not released disaster funding to Puerto Rico, which I believe is sinful, because of the concerns that the money would not go to the people but be wasted and abused instead. Eliminating the validity of that comment is I don't subscribe to, but besides the point. How do you eliminate the concern, that concern? One of the reasons that we included a provision for a disaster reconstruction coordinator for Puerto Rico in the discussion draft. This coordinator would work with local disaster recovery agency, at this point Core 3, and federal officials to expedite and provide some reassurance to allow those funds to flow the way they should. So the coordinator position along the lines that was created for Sandy and Katrina, could that be beneficial for Puerto Rico?
If we're talking about the federal coordinating officer created under the National Disaster Framework, that it was used in Louisiana and any other state, yes, sir, because that will help the coordination at the federal level. At the state level, we already centralized the coordination based on the best practices, following the model of New York, Louisiana, and many others. So that's exactly the position of Ranking Member Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez. That's exactly what we need. We need effective coordination at the federal level. It's really hard when we as officials have to come to FEMA, to HUD, Treasury, DOE, and many others, and sometimes we don't see that coordination that we have at the state level. Again, in the last 2 years, we have managed over $10 billion with zero finding at the state level, and I think that the record attests to the fact.
My time is up, and if we have another opportunity, Ms. Jarsko, the couple of questions I'll have for you, I'll come back around to that, okay? Thank you. And at this point, let me turn to the ranking member for her questions, comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are several issues that should be discussed here, and we were talking just about that federal coordinator. One thing is, Congress and the President signed a law approving $49 billion approximately to the island. But yet, we just have received $1.5 billion that are under the HUD department on the island. Again, we haven't received the publication in the Federal Register for the next tranche of funds. We're talking about a federal coordinator or expediter to make this money available to the island. That's one thing. But adding layers with another appointee locally, I think, will do the work worst and adding more bureaucratic layers. So how can we mix having a federal coordinator like it was used in other states and the one proposing in the bill? Mr. Marrero.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Again, the way I totally agree with your position. The fact if we add a layer, I think it will just, again, it will be disruptive to the process. The people of Puerto Rico, the government of Puerto Rico has done everything that has been asked by the federal government to access this funding. On the CDBG side, in less than a year, we develop the action plan, but we submit it and we get it approved and we sign the grant agreement for the initial allocation. On the FEMA side, we were required on October 2017 to create a centralized oversight authority. We did that. We were required to hire third-party experts. We did that. We were required to implement internal controls, processes to make sure that the money will flow to the people that need it. We did that. And if you go to recovery.pr, we have the most transparent information of any other U.S. jurisdiction as to recovery. The way that we see is that At the state level, ma'am, the
So
Core
you-
3
you-
director.
Do you support a federal coordinator for expediting, but not a local one? That's the.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
We will, yes, we will support a federal coordinator to expedite.
The whole federal government or just to PREPA? Energy?
No, I think it's to the federal government, to the federal government.
I got a question to Ms. Jaresco. And although this was not supposed to be a hearing on recovery funds, it is written in the testimony, and this is one of the main issues the island is facing right now. How can we receive the funds that are being already appropriated by Congress and by the President? In your written testimony reports, your projections counted on Puerto Rico receiving about $75 billion in federal recovery aid during the next decade. However, last Thursday, the board submitted to the Municipal Securities Regulatory Board a statement that of $69 billion originally forecast in FEMA and CDBG-DR funds, they are now expect that the obligations and delays will mean only 39 will get there. I don't know if we were talking about the 10-year period. What is this about? And again, where did the expectation of 75 or $69 billion over the next decade came from? Second question will be, how this will affect then the fiscal plan and the plan of adjustment? And third, it is not the case that much of the slowness in getting the funds going has been part of the federal agencies themselves. HUD has been sitting on $8 billion in grant agreements since May. How can we complain, and how can the federal agencies complain that we are not using efficiently the funds when the money is not even in the island?
Thank you, Congresswoman. With regard to the first question, there seems to be a misunderstanding as to the document that was released. The belief of the board is what's represented in the fiscal plan with regard to the $75 or so billion of both federal funds and private insurance proceeds expected. That number is built up from conversations with the federal government, FEMA, CDBG, as well as with the Insurance Commissioner of Puerto Rico with regard to the private insurance numbers. And that is the belief and our best judgment at this time as to what is expected. The document that was released last week is a document that came from discussions with creditors and was specifically an outline of risks to the fiscal plan, downside risks that the creditors had to keep in mind. As you can well imagine, in discussions with the creditors, the conversation most often leads to upside to the fiscal plan, how much more monies may be received by Puerto Rico, earned by Puerto Rico, or less can be spent. That document, which outlined a variety of risks, one of which was a slowing down or lack of receipt, had to be put together in response to those creditors who are asking all the time about upside, and we needed to share with them as well the downside risks that exist. It is the best judgment of the Oversight Board that all of the funds will be received, and hopefully on the schedule that has been provided to us over time by the federal government, together with Core 3 and the government of Puerto Rico. In terms of your second question, with regard to how would a slowdown affect the plan of adjustment, first and foremost, if the number remains the same, that would not affect it in any great amount. The board has proposed, together with the government of Puerto Rico today, a plan of adjustment that limits annual debt service to $1.5 billion per year, which is less than 10% of own source revenues, in other words, taxes and other revenues collected, not federal funding, excluding federal funding, less than 10% of fiscal year 19 revenues, which is this year, and constant for the next 30 years.
Let me now turn to Ms. Napolitano for her time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Jaresco, you represent a very impressive list of the accomplishments of the board in your statement, including the recent proposed plan of adjustment, which you say enables Puerto Rico to reach its highest real potential. Where businesses, large and small, can have the confidence they need to invest and expand with certainty, and where the people of Puerto Rico can expect the government to provide safety, education, and public services they need desperately. And are the people of Puerto Rico and others wrong in believing that all the board has meant is crippling austerity measures?
I understand and I accept that this fiscal plan and the measures taken by the board can sometimes cause pain, and cynicism, and I understand that. However, the fact of the matter is, many of the things that the board, together with the government of Puerto Rico, have been able to accomplish are for the benefit of the people of Puerto Rico, including in the plan of adjustment. In terms of the things that we've done aside from the plan of adjustment, we have worked together with the government of Puerto Rico to provide greater transparency to the
Right,
people.
but when you do that, do you provide that same information to the general public? I'd like to release the balance of my time to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Charesco. Almost, the board has won almost every legal challenge brought by creditors on its decisions. And so my question is, why would it be unreasonable to believe that if essential services were defined as one of the provisions, one of the recommendations prescribes, as we do in this discussion draft, that you wouldn't win those challenges as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish I could say that we had won all of our challenges, but we have not, and we have over 100 cases pending. I think that you've seen a variety of outcomes in the Title III court, some having been overturned at the First Circuit, and there is no certainty. I think the key issue here is to narrowly define essential services, or leave to the deliberation of the courtroom the narrow definition of essential services, potentially puts at risk things like costs that are that the board has determined together with the government of Puerto Rico are very necessary, whether they be environmental, whether they be in the arts, in culture, the funding of the Institute of Culture of Puerto Rico, for example, as well as other areas which might be challenged in a courtroom.
Okay. So the point being, there's more of definition than opposition in your statement?
It is the risk of forcing and moving the definition into the courtroom, yes. The Promesa, as stated today, the language that Congress provided,
Okay.
does not require the board to define it, but ensure the funding of, which we believe we have done together with the government of Puerto Rico.
Okay, my last question, if I may, Mr. Esco. You claim that the discussion draft in your testimony is a distraction from the real work already in progress that the board is making. And yet, ordinary Puerto Ricans continue to decry the board's existence. In fact, having read the testimony of the next panel and primarily the elected officials, repeal of Promesa seems to be a constant throughout those commentaries. And yet, so decry the board's existence and call for its abolishment. I'm talking about the public in general because they believe the board has primarily been working to ensure creditors receive as much repayment of their bonds as possible. And you talked about cynicism, and I mentioned the word and others. Since it appears that you're not in support of most of the provisions in the draft, what do you suggest can be done to enable a favorable outlook by the Puerto Rican people of the work that you're doing and that the board is doing?
I think the key issue is for us to move forward as quickly as possible, remove the burden of this bankruptcy, define what is affordable and sustainable, and work together with the government of Puerto Rico to put in place a sustainable financial budget, which then leads to the end of the oversight board as quickly as reasonably possible under the law.
Is that the support of the people of Puerto Rico, the voters of Puerto Rico? To that end, doesn't that facilitate what you're talking about and make it that much easier to have a support from the people in general as opposed to the opposition?
Of course, sir, and we do have the support of certain segments of the people on certain issues. So when we work together with the government to increase pay for the police, I assure you that the police are supportive of that increase in pay and the ability of the government together with this board to find the funding within the budget and focus it on that need.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lambert, time is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank the ranking member for her leadership on this issue. Ms. Jaresko, I have a couple of questions. If the proposed legislation to amend Promesa were enacted, how would it impact the work that the board has done and is in the process of completing especially when it comes to PREPA and the restructuring of the debt? I know you talked about this briefly in your opening remarks, but with a little bit of more detail, please.
Thank you. Specifically with regard to PREPA, as my colleague mentioned in his testimony and I did, we are right now significantly progressing along a path of attracting a private operator to unbundle PREPA, separate the transmission and grid, and have it managed by a private operator. I believe that the selection could occur under the P3 law in Puerto Rico before the end of this year. I think that installing a revitalization coordinator at PREPA today would confuse those bidders, confuse the process, and potentially delay it, if not even make it impossible. From the perspective of transforming PREPA into something different, new, something in which both the federal government and the people of Puerto Rico could have confidence in the operations, I believe that the path that we're on is the most efficient and that it's the most beneficial. With regard to the debt restructuring, the key concern we have is whether or not creditors will use the concept that is represented in the draft legislation with regard to discharging the unsecured debt to further demand during this restructuring and in the future secured debt from the government of Puerto Rico, which would be incrementally additional cost and much less advantageous to the people of Puerto Rico.
Okay, thank you. And a general question I'd like to ask, if there ever were to be a bailout that allows Puerto Rico to write off substantial amounts of debt, which I believe this bill does, to the detriment of investors who put money in good faith, what would that do to the future of investment in Puerto Rico?
So yes, sir, that is, of course, an issue. Creditors who believe that they are at risk of being removed from the scene will likely not provide Puerto Rico in the future with access to funds that are desperately going to be needed to continue to invest in the capital infrastructure of the island. And so not only the bondholders themselves, but future investors in the island, both equity and debt, will take note and be fearful of investing into an environment like that.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. This is a question to Mr. Marrero and to Jaresco. We were talking about the reduction pensions plan and the plan of adjustment. And although I know the House and the Senate in Puerto Rico both approve being against any cut to the reduction or reduction to the pension system, some of you say that this is the best path to ensure Puerto Rico's come out of the bankruptcy. My question will be, what's the reasoning behind it when you got pensioners that are gaining less than $1,200 a month, and you're proposing a cut of 8.9% to each of them? Mr. Marrero?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The pension cut that is proposed in the plan of adjustment is 8.5%, but never going below $1,200. The only reason that there is a pension cut proposed in the plan of adjustment is because of the bankruptcy laws in the United States and the requirement to not have disparate treatment. There is no desire on the part of anyone in government, in the Oversight Board, to cut pensions. However, left with no reasonable proposal that protects those pensioners at that $1,200, we again do not wish to leave it to the court and the creditors to argue. It's important to note that this pension proposal not only includes a cut, but also includes setting aside some $6 billion of available surplus in these early years, as per the fiscal plan, into a pension trust to assure that pensions can be paid for the next 30 years, regardless of the fiscal situation in Puerto Rico, even if we fall into deficit times. In addition to that, it has a segment that allows for the restoration of a cut if the government of Puerto Rico achieves excess surplus, in other words, has a better outcome in any fiscal year than is projected in the fiscal plan. 10% of that excess goes in any fiscal year then to restore that pension cut this year. So in essence, when the Committee of Retirees agreed with the board on supporting this plan, they did that because of the benefit of having 30 years of security of their pensions ahead of them, as well as the opportunity in better times to restore that cut.
Mr. Marrero?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Just for the record, to be clear, the position on the public policy of the government of Puerto Rico is that we are opposed to any pension cuts. And that's why we left the negotiation table in June when the official committee of retirees, a committee established by the U.S. trustee as part of the bankruptcy proceeding, they agree to a pension cut. However, after careful consideration and in light of the best interest of the people of Puerto Rico, not only the retirees, but the people of Puerto Rico, we agreed not to oppose that agreement that was duly entered with the official committee of retirees, because opposing that agreement will be harsher for them.
Time is up. Thank you. Let me now turn to Mr. Gallego, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To all the witnesses here today, thank you for your testimony at this important hearing. I was new to Congress when Promesa was passed, but actually voted against it, knowing that it was a bad deal for Puerto Rico. And in the years since, I've witnessed the plight of the Puerto Rican people as they have dealt with a struggling economy, the difficult and sometimes demoralizing process of implementing Promesa, and of course, the devastation of Hurricane Maria. While we continue to pressure this administration to keep its promise to Puerto Rico and disperse the billions of dollars of aid Congress has already approved for relief aid and mitigation, it's important for us to also plan for the future. That's why I'm grateful to all of our witnesses who are here today to make sure that we are doing what we can ensure to make sure Puerto Rico is a prosperous and empowered future. With that, I have a few questions. For Mr. Marrero. Ms. Marrero, in your testimony, you mentioned some difficulties in the budgeting process under Promesa related to the board's ability to set overly prescriptive limits and the Puerto Rican government's lack of ability to appeal. Could you expand on that or give an example of this particular problem?
Sure, definitely. Thank you for the question and for all the help for the people of Puerto Rico, Mr. Gallego. I can attest to the fact that you have felt a lot during this process. As to the specific issue that we have in front of us, is about micro budgeting. We have been supportive of the debt restructuring tool that Promesa has, and we understand that we have to collaborate with the oversight board in order to move forward. That's the spirit of the law, and we agree with it. However, we believe that the role of the oversight board should be tied to the fact that they have to set the spending limits. There are two objectives within Promesa: to achieve fiscal responsibility, that's essentially balanced budget for 4 consecutive years, and access to capital markets at reasonable rates. That's essentially get out of bankruptcy. And that's what we really want to make sure that we can be focused on, because that's the ultimate goal. Let's end bankruptcy, let's end Title III, let's terminate the oversight board, and we regain access to capital markets. However, we believe that the role of the oversight board should be to set the size of the room, not necessarily to arrange the furniture or to tell me where's the furniture going to be. So again, they have to set the spending limit, the cap limits, and we decide how it's going to be spend the money, because in the end, it should be the responsibility of the elected government of the people of Puerto Rico to determine, according to its police power and policy-making functions, how the money is going to be spent. Not only for our administration, for for other administrations to come.
And that overprescription creates a scenario where it takes longer for the decision and execution cycle that the government has to make. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, sir. Exactly.
Okay. Thank you. Let's switch over to Ms. Jaresko. If I said your name correctly, I apologize. Similar to my question to Mr. Marrero, how has the board worked with the Puerto Rican government, or not a similar question, a different question. How has the board worked with the Puerto Rican government to improve the elected leaders' autonomy in the areas, in this area, or eliminate the problems they have experienced with the budgeting process under Promesa?
It is our belief that in working on a more detailed budget and with giving more transparency and public knowledge to how the budget is being spent, we are helping the people of Puerto Rico to ensure better decisions and helping the government of Puerto Rico. An example that I gave earlier is specifically with the Police Bureau. Last year, given that there is unfortunately little financial management in many of the spending entities, it came to the attention of the board, by following this level of detail, that the Police Bureau had been underspending its personnel budget, even though the secretary at that time had been announcing that he did not have enough for personnel. He was misleading his own team, and police were leaving the island until we could hold a public hearing and show that, in fact, he had underspent and had more than enough. In fact, some of that underspent went to solve other problems within the budget. We don't take a lot of time for the reapportionments if the reapportionments are requested on a timely basis with information. When the issue of rape kits came up and the need to spend $3 million, we gave our agreement within 40 minutes.
Right, and before time runs out, are there any other ideas or proposals the board may have regarding modifications to Promesa that the committee has not considered? That could be helpful, that could both work for all sides included, and also obviously work for the Promesa board?
We don't have any requests for further amendments to Promesa.
Do you have any, you may have a request, do you have any suggestions?
Not at this time, sir.
So in your opinion, everything that we're doing right now is copacetic and it is working well?
As I said, in my testimony, we did agree that the additional disclosure would be valuable, and other parts, a federal coordinator that as my colleague had mentioned, would help with the federal oversight of the disaster funds would be helpful. There are parts of this draft that we agreed with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You might.
Mr. Whitman, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Ms. Jaresco, question for you. You had mentioned in your testimony that the people of Puerto Rico recently demanding better governance, and more responsive government services, and we know recently the resignation of Governor Roseo. With all of this change happening within the Commonwealth's government, how challenging is it for the Financial Oversight and Management Board going not only now but in the future, given the government's opposition to helping correct some of the inefficiencies in local government? We know the dynamic between local government and state government or territory government there have been significant. So I just want to get your perspective about how the current situation unfolds.
I think we've had a very collaborative relationship with the new governor and the new government officials. Many of the people had stayed, so there's been some continuity. Others have changed, and there have been improvements. I think that our focus on working as quickly as possible to restore sustainability and remove this debt burden is probably the single thing that we can agree on. There are always differences in the details, but generally I think it's working better for the people of Puerto Rico not to be constantly litigating ones against each other.
That's good to hear, because I know the divisions there have created some challenges. I want to get your thought on Section 9 of this discussion draft, which would allow Puerto Rico to cancel some of its unsecured debt. What do you believe would be the effect of this provision on the Commonwealth's ability to fund services needed for the people of Puerto Rico?
I believe there are two primary concerns that we need to have. One is that the risk of having that unsecured debt discharge raises the risk that creditors today, in the midst of negotiations, will demand better security for the debt, and that security is costly to the government of Puerto Rico. The second great risk, I believe, is what it means with regard to future potential access to markets and access to capital that Puerto Rico will, of course, need as they move forward.
Thank you. I want to also look at Section 8 of the draft bill that repeals Title V of Promesa, which put in place a process by which the Revitalization Coordinator could designate critical infrastructure projects for expedited permitting process removal, trying to speed things up to make sure when you see a need that the need can be addressed quickly. I know in the past that there have been a number of economic or hurdles for economic development that was really put in place by local government bureaucracy. Give me your sense on how this repeal of this section would hinder economic advancement.
I think Title V was very well intentioned when established, but the utilization of it has been very limited by the private sector for multiple reasons. The value that Title V brings is an accelerated permitting on the island, and to the extent that the government has worked to already accelerate that permitting process, many private sector players have not chosen to apply for Title V. Title V has been of great interest to those who'd like to invest in generation and generation facilities on the island, private sector energy generation. But given that situation and the bankruptcy that we are working through at PREPA, those contracts, those opportunities have been somewhat delayed by the bankruptcy process. I believe that Title V could be improved if it included additional access to improving federal permitting, and I believe that Title V still has an important role to play as we move forward in economic development on the island.
Very good. Do you believe in looking at the current situation and the expeditious manner in which projects either have or have not proceeded, that there are additional things that that the federal government can do for the Commonwealth, or are there things that the Commonwealth can do by itself, or are there more efforts that need to take place in simplifying the relationship between the Commonwealth and local governments?
I think there is a great deal of work that still needs to be done in the ease of doing business for all business people, Puerto Rican business people as well as non-island investors. And I think that many of them are outlined in the fiscal plan and are being worked on currently by the government of Puerto Rico. The areas that have been focused on is permitting in particular, because that's a #1 problem. But aside from permitting, there are a variety of other administrative burdens, for example, registration of property, the administrative nature and burdensome nature of taxes. So I think there are many things there. I think with regard to looking at municipalities and the relationship between the territories and municipalities, the single thing that is criticized most often by the business sector is something called an inventory tax, which is right now an important revenue stream for municipalities, but is also very burdensome to the business sector.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to thank the witnesses again. My apologies. I think earlier I referred to Puerto Rico as the territory. It is indeed the Commonwealth, just as Virginia is the Commonwealth, so my apologies for that oversight. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Mr. Sablan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing and hearing us next week. We're in a very unfortunate situation in terms of Puerto Rico, and I hope we get out of this. But I have some questions for Ms. Aresco, if I may, please. Ms. Aresco, in your testimony, you stated the board's proposed plan has 10 key points, and I see that. The plan is to ensure that 74% of current and future pensions are not cut. Who are the other 26% of those affected, and what are the proposed cuts to this population?
The average pension of the 26% on average that are not being cut is $1,500. Again, no cut can take any pensioner below $1,200. What is being offered to all of those 100% is security that over the next 30 years, funds will be invested by an independent trust.
Yeah, I
can't
see
be
that.
touched by governments, politicians in the future, and assure their pensions.
Yeah, I see that. And it's too late to go back and point fingers as who's responsible for some of these problems. But let's hope and see that when, after all is said and done, that more is done than is said. You also mentioned the board hopes to establish debt management policy to ensure Puerto Rico never again finds itself in this situation. Could you please elaborate on which steps the board will be taking to ensure this, and what specific policy measures will you be promoting?
Yes, the proposed plan of adjustment reflecting that Cobra and Kim debt review report that my colleague described to you earlier specifically outlines different principles so that Puerto Rico doesn't return to those practices. Number one, new debt can only be used to finance capital improvements, capital expenditures. It cannot be used, as it has in the past, to finance operating expenses and satisfy deficits.
Thank you.
Second, refinancing debt can only be used to actually decrease the amount of debt. So you cannot borrow to take out borrowing if it increases your costs overall. And finally, there has to be an amortization within 2 years for any new debt of its issuance date.
All right, thank you. What has been the impact of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees' support for the plan of adjustment, and do you expect further support for the plan from any other organized or unions?
Yes, we have reached agreement with ASCME, which on the island is SPU, and that agreement reflects, as I described earlier, the agreement to provide collective bargaining agreements to ensure 5 years in terms of next policy and next agreement with that union, as well as providing a higher level of health care on a monthly basis, as well as restoring that $1.3 billion, as I said, of employee withholding in something called Sistema 2000, which was a hybrid pension system that has disappeared. We are in active discussions with other unions, both those represented nationally as well as those with only local representation. And we do hope and we believe we will reach additional agreements.
Thank you. And what has been the impact of your constructive working relationship with Governor Vasquez ask questions on the board's work with the government on fiscal plans and government spending and delivery of services.
I believe that we've together made sure that we can answer questions more quickly, that we can restore things that have, for whatever reason, fallen on the side, and that we can respond to the needs of the people, whether they be providing air conditioning at a Bayamon Women's Correction Facility quickly, or whether they are fixing problems and identifying where to find funds for very important things like special education needs.
Thank you. Please excuse my cynicism sometimes, because what happens in Puerto Rico affects the Northern Marianas, and both Puerto Rico and the Northern Marianas are commonwealths, but it doesn't really matter what you're called. It could be called colonies, so long as we have the insular cases doctrine, and which is a discriminatory and actually treats people. We're not possessions. You don't own us, Mr. Whitman. Nobody owns us. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, sir, they cannot impose a board like they did in Puerto Rico without your permission, but with Puerto Rico and the Northern Marianas, they could. And excuse my cynicism, we're right not at a medical cliff, as you may understand, and we're having problems renegotiating both bipartisan and bicameral because of this problem with that has happened in Puerto Rico. Very unfortunate, but my time is up, so I'll come to that at some later time. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sablan. Mr. McClintock, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I opposed Promesa because I felt it broke the most important promise that a government can make, and that is to put its full faith and credit behind its bonds. I was concerned that this breach of faith would cost Puerto Rico access to credit markets at reasonable rates for many years to come, and establish a dangerous precedent that would affect our other territorial governments. I was also concerned that it would relieve the elected officials of their responsibility for this mess, with an unelected board that's insulated from direct responsibility, which I think set another dangerous precedent. This arrangement's now been in place for 3 years. We were promised it would put the government's finances in order, establish a plan to repay bondholders, restore Puerto Rico's access to credit markets at reasonable rates. It's not clear to me any of these objectives has been achieved. And in fact, the degree of political instability seems to have increased rather than decreased. So my first question, and I'll start with Mr. Marrero, is what am I missing?
Well, I think that you're missing the fact that we have already restructured $23 billion of debt already, not only tax-backed bonds, but also the water utility as well as the government bank. We also have been able to give a security to pensioners. Today, the retirees are able to receive their pension check at their mailbox because we transformed the depleted retirement system into a pay-go. So 22% of our budget goes to pay retirees. Also, I think that the fact that in 3 years, we already have $23 billion restructured. We have a plan of adjustment already filed.
Restructured or repaid?
Restructured, and we...
Restructured. Well, again, that's exactly the point that I'm making, is I don't see a lot of progress in straightening out the territory, the Commonwealth's finances, and
Well, with all due respect, sir, we have already two budget without overspend.
how much debt has actually been retired? Has been repaid?
Of the 23 billion we have, I think 6 billion, around 6 to 8 billion between COFINA and GDP.
Okay, now that's debt that has actually been repaid to...
No. I said restructure.
I understand.
Reduce, I'm sorry, I didn't get the
And
question.
what I'm saying is there's a big distinction between restructured and repaid.
Yes, sir, and that's why we asked Congress, when Congress passed Promesa, it gave Puerto Rico a tool to restructure debt to a sustainable level in order to repay our debts. And yes, sir, the intent of the government of Puerto Rico is to repay its
But
debts
that was the
to a
intent.
sustainable level.
That was the intent 3 years ago. I wonder how different the situation would be if the full responsibility for this mess was placed where it belongs, on the elected officials of Puerto Rico, and that the normal process for dealing with this debt had been actually followed.
Well, if I may add, sir, before the approval of Promesa, the government of Puerto Rico did not have the capacity to restructure its debt.
So why not?
Because it was not allowed. The bankruptcy code only allowed for municipalities of a state
Right.
to restructure. So a city, counties, they can restructure, but no state can restructure its debts because there's no mechanism for
Well,
that.
that's exactly right, which is why their full faith and credit means something.
Exactly.
Puerto Rico's promise of full faith and credit now means absolutely nothing.
With all due respect, sir, Puerto Rico is a territory subject to the plenary powers of Congress under Article 4.
Yes,
and
but
it was
this was
based
a
on
mess
that.
not made by Congress. We've made our own mess. This was a mess made by the people of Puerto Rico by electing irresponsible officials that made these decisions
with all
over the
due
years. And I do wonder if at some point, there's something to be said about accountability.
Yes, sir. However, I have to disagree with you slightly. I think that the responsibility of Puerto Rico is shared, not only with the people of Puerto Rico, but also with the people of the United States and the federal government, as it is a territory subject to the plenary powers of Congress.
Many that believe that a mess that's made in my state of California ought to stay in California, and a mess that's made in Puerto Rico ought to stay in Puerto Rico. Mr. Resco,
But to the extent that it's a
I'll give you the last word.
I will simply say, sir, that Puerto Rico has started to repay in those areas where they've restructured the debt. For example, in COFINA, which is a sales and use tax, we are starting to repay our debt. In fact, those new bonds are trading at above par, and traditional municipal bondholders are once again holding Puerto Rico debt. So I believe in the end that this restructuring, which enables it to be sustainable, provides those creditors with a better chance of a reasonable repayment of what is affordable than had an alternative, no alternative to Promesa been put in place.
Soto, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming today. It's a complex history, the history of the debt of Puerto Rico. You have so much to do with both the relationship between the territory and the federal government. 936, underfunding of Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, child tax credit, all unequal treatment, and all helping contribute to where we are today. The good news is we've already passed bipartisan legislation to create Medicaid parity, and just recently, last week, to help low-income seniors on Medicare. And we know the history. Puerto Rico used to be able to file bankruptcy until I think about 1983, 1984. Because it's not a state, it doesn't have sovereign immunity, so it can't reject debt. It's in a weird spot, and it was taking out of the bankruptcy code without really much reason to it. And so here we are a few years ago where you have to do something about it. So Promesa was this compromise that has been contorted and had sacrifices, and now we're here to see whether we need to reform it or not. We've had some movement. $23 billion in debt restructuring certainly is a lot, and lowering the debt service from $4.2 billion to $1.5 billion. Those are all big milestones. One thing I continue to hear from a lot of folks on the island and in my district and others is about this idea of eliminating the debt. So I want to start out with that. Mr. Marrero, Mr. Resco, is there any legal way to eliminate the entire debt?
No, not under the bankruptcy code, as far as I understand it, sir. None.
Mr. Marrero?
Right now, we have to go through the process delineated by Promesa. It's the only process that we have to restructure our debt.
The bill draft talks about an audit, and I understand that Promesa's already done an audit, but what would be the harm, since there is a perception that maybe the audit was done well or maybe it wasn't? Would there be any harm in having an audit while we continue on with these issues, Mr. Marrero, then Mr. Resco?
I believe it will be a waste of taxpayers' money, because in the end, let's remember the fact that not only all the fees that we are incurring as part of the process, the government has to pay them, but also the oversight board, as well as the advisor of any other committee that is created through the process. So for me, it's a waste of taxpayers' money
Thank you,
and
Mr.
time.
Marrero. Mr. Resco, sorry, my time's limited.
I believe the two values of doing an audit have been achieved. One, to identify which debt needs to be invalidated in the court. And as we described, we've submitted for over $9 billion is being invalidated by different players, including the Special Claims Committee of the Board. And second, to identify the practices of the past that led Puerto Rico to this situation and avoid them going forward by putting a debt management policy in place so that this never occurs again.
Okay, Ms. Jaresko, what do you think the timetable is of winding down Promesa based upon the current course of history so far?
I believe that we first need to get the Commonwealth through this plan of adjustment and have a court confirm it. Hopefully, depending on the amount of litigation, that would be 2020, next year. And after that, we would have 4 years of balanced budgets. And that, in my mind, would take us through the end of Promesa.
So 2024 is what you're estimating right now. What about you, Mr. Marrero? Based upon your experience, where are we at?
Again, our priority is to get out of bankruptcy as soon as we can. So we do believe that as soon as we get out of bankruptcy, out of Title III, and we have access to capital markets, we just have to finish the process to achieve fiscal responsibility.
Thank you. Now, lastly is the Reconstruction Coordinator. I can appreciate, having spoke with both the governor and folks on both sides of the aisle about this, after already having a federal layer with the Promesa Fiscal Board, having just another layer is obviously something people are very concerned about. But we know that Core 3 has faced barriers with the administration. So, Mr. Marrero, what are the barriers? Because we allocated $42.5 billion, and you all have received, what, 14, 15 billion to date? So what are the barriers you're facing with the federal government right now?
Well, with all due respect, we believe it's just bureaucracy and lack of timely decision-making. From our perspective on the CDBG side, let's talk about the CDBG side. CDBG side, for the $1.5 billion, which was the initial action plan, we did it in less than a year. It took Louisiana 3 years to access the initial funding on CDBG side. We did it. We did it in a time record. We also, by the way, at that time, the Undersecretary of HUD said publicly that it was the best action plan that she had seen at her post at HUD.
Thank you, Mr. Marrero, because I have to wind up. But if we could just put a switch into this bill, Mr. Chairman, to make the Trump administration release the funds, I think we would actually resolve this. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Johnson, sir, you're recognized. Oh, Westerman, I'm sorry. Jumped ahead. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Ms. Jaresko, the current labor force participation numbers in Puerto Rico are hovering around 40%, which is 20% or more lower than what we have here in the mainland. Can you tell me what factors would be contributing to that?
Yes, the labor participation rate is affected tremendously by the amount of burdensome regulation in the labor market and the lack of free movement within the labor market. One of the things the board had done previously, with the support of former Governor Roseo, was to suggest the repeal of Law 80, which did not allow for employment at will. Employment at will exists in 49 out of 50 states, with the exception of Montana. And that, unfortunately, was not acceptable at that time to the legislature. So you continue to have very high severance levels, which is a discouragement to employers to employ in the formal market additional people. Amongst other things, of course, we need to increase the amount of investment on the island to create new jobs, jobs that the people of Puerto Rico can fulfill. And that then directly translates into our investment into human capital, making sure people are trained for the jobs of the future.
So how's this low labor participation rate impeded the rebuilding process in Puerto Rico? And can you address that?
I don't think at this point that it's impeded the reconstruction post-Hurricane Irma and Maria. To the extent that there might be a possible conclusion, it's that we now have not enough construction companies to support the level of construction that's being demanded. But I think that it is a broader and bigger issue for economic development in Puerto Rico.
So of this 40% that participates in the workforce, what percentage of that is employed by the Puerto Rican government?
I don't know the number, sir. I can get back to you. It is a significant portion, but I don't know the percentage.
So, and what effects does this have on the sustainability of Puerto Rico's pension system?
I think we've just issued a report, I recommend it's called a 211, to talk about all of the different problems that have occurred to defund the pension system in Puerto Rico. I think that the number of employees is one element, but I think the greater elements that have led to the defunding is insufficient funding, borrowing from those funds, as well as increasing benefits that accrue additional pension liability without increasing the investment into the fund.
So do you believe the right sizing of the Puerto Rican government is needed?
I do believe that the right sizing of the government is needed for several reasons. One, to reflect the actual depopulation of the island and the current demography of the island. Second, to reflect the fiscal capacity of the island. And third, frankly speaking, because it's very difficult to manage a government with over 150 government agencies. Therefore, some right sizing, some consolidation, and the governor and the previous governor and the governor have agreed on some consolidation, would make the government more more efficient to manage and more responsive to the people of Puerto Rico.
So has the government, or has the Oversight Board worked to streamline or consolidate any aspects of the Puerto Rican government?
Yes, we have, and we've seen success already in two departments in particular. The Department of Economic Development has consolidated a variety of bureaus, and the Department of Public Safety has consolidated and begun the process. This consolidation, to be clear, means a centralized administration, procurement, and budgeting, whereas the bureaus continue to do, of course, their individual functions, whether they be firefighters or police or other.
So you talked about it a little bit, it's been brought up already. We know that the Puerto Rico pension system is virtually bankrupt. Can you go into more detail on what the Oversight Board is doing to prevent the situation from getting worse, especially since the sheer percentage of the island that is employed by the government and expects a pension?
I think the most important thing we've done, and I think it's something that in fact places Puerto Rico maybe ahead of the 50 states that are also challenged at times with funding their pension systems, is that we've moved to a pay-as-you-go system. We no longer are attempting with the employment retirement system to continue to fund a defined benefit plan. All employees have moved on a going forward basis to a defined contribution type of plan, and payment for pensions, those who are currently retired, is paid from the budget from the general fund each year.
I know my colleague, Ranking Member Bishop, did a lot of work on that when he was in the Utah legislature and kind of led the country in getting pension systems sustainable. Maybe he could be a resource for you, because that's not just a problem in the Commonwealth, it's a problem in many states across our country. I yield back.
Mr. San Nicolas, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Marrero, you mentioned earlier that you believe that the Promesa board should be determining the size of the room, not the placement of the furniture. Could you elaborate with some examples on how that's occurring?
Sure, definitely. I'll take, for example, the Christmas bonus. I think that to the extent that we have, according to Promesa, the Oversight Board will tell us what is the forecast on the revenues, and we will use that figure and start working on the budget. We believe that, according to Promesa, the Oversight Board has fiscal and budgetary powers. We know that. Obviously, that was the responsibility that he was bestowed with. However, the fact that once the spending limit is determined, we are the ones, the elected government of the people of Puerto Rico, should be the one to determine how that money should be spent. For example, the Christmas bonus in Puerto Rico, even though that we have been, we're working on that, and we are confident that we will come to a resolution to this matter, but in the past, it was a point of contention, because even though it says a bonus, for us, it was a supplementary wages. It was a matter, it was a way to do social justice to the people of Puerto Rico, to the workers of Puerto Rico, that they don't earn the same as on the mainland. So again, that was one of the areas, as many others, in which we believe the Oversight Board is overstepping its role into the area that should be led to the people of Puerto Rico.
Ms. Yaresco, is it Yaresco? We're all trying here. You know, when I listen to Mr. Marrero and what he's sharing, I have a strong tendency to agree with him. I'm a congressman from Guam, and my district is also a U.S. territory similar to Puerto Rico, and my colleague from the Northern Mariana Islands, as well as my colleague from the U.S. Virgin Islands and American Samoa. And, we have a lot of fiscal challenges as territories because we receive inequitable funding from the federal government for liabilities that would receive a much different rate of funding if they were being incurred in any of the 50 states. And oftentimes, our territories tend to try and get creative in ways to try and make up for those federal funding shortfalls. And, it oftentimes results in deficit spending and bond borrowing and the like. And, I think that's something that territories need to work on to correct here at the federal level so that we're not suffering those same inequities that tend to contribute to our fiscal challenges. That being said, my concern is that if the Promesa board is overly involved in the operational decisions of the government, how is the local government going to be able to build the credibility necessary to satisfy creditors and investors when Promesa goes away? If the operational decisions are being made by the board and not the local government, wouldn't that make interest rates higher, and wouldn't that make investors more wary that when Promesa is gone, the local government hasn't demonstrated the credibility over the years that it was in place?
Thank you. I don't believe we are overstepping in the budgetary area, and I think what we're leaving behind is a much more detailed and transparent
That's not my
budget.
question, Ms. Carrasco. My question is, wouldn't that injure the credibility of the government for investors and for creditors if the government was not fully responsible for making the decisions during the period that Promesa was in place?
No, I don't believe so. I think what we're leaving behind is a better financial environment, one which is more transparent for those creditors, one where the government on a going forward basis, the legislature, which you'll hear from on a going forward basis, will have more data and more ability to do the same work that we are doing right now from a budgetary standpoint, but they will be doing it themselves on a going forward basis.
And I really would have to respectfully disagree with you, because at the end of the day, creditors and investors are going to be looking to management and whether or not management is going to be able to deliver on the revenue projections that are being put in place. And if management is not the ones who are actively involved in making the financial decisions, and if they're not the final arbiters of those decisions, then the credibility isn't being established. And that's the case when you're talking about the private sector, that's the case when you're talking about municipal governments in the United States, and that's the case when you're talking about territorial governments. And Mr. Rico, I just wanted to close with my concern with respect to this, and I hope my colleagues can indulge. But, I pulled up your background, and your background in particular with respect to your work history in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, you were advocating for a technocratic government, at least with respect to what I'm reading here. And I'm just concerned that this is almost turning into a practice that you're getting excited about without necessarily factoring in whether or not it's in the best interest of the people of Puerto Rico and the government of Puerto Rico to be able to establish the credibility necessary for them to be able to emerge from Promesa with the full faith and confidence of creditors and investors when this process is over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Gomer, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the witnesses being here. And like Mr. San Nicolas, I was looking at the background, Mr. Esco. What we provided said you were an American, or are an American-born Ukrainian investment banker who served as Ukraine's Minister of Finance 2014 to 2016. I'm curious, in your position there in Ukraine, were you aware of Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko dispatching Olga Vilkova or any other Ukrainian official to the U.S. in order to conduct an influence campaign on the 2016 election here in the United States?
I'm here to report on Promesa and Puerto Rico.
Your credibility is an issue, just as
I don't
Mr.
have
San
any
Nicolas.
knowledge of the details that you just described,
I
sir.
didn't ask if you had knowledge of the details. I
don't
asked
have-
if you had any knowledge of the president sending Vilkova to the U.S.
I do not have any knowledge of that.
You don't have any knowledge on how that was financed as Director of Finance.
It did not occur while I was Minister of Finance, sir.
Well, you were there.
Mr. Gomer, if I may.
This is critical to her credibility. She's now director of this
credibility
finance
that I bring-
operation
No, I'm
in
not-
Puerto Rico.
I'm not trying to dictate the questions you can ask. The time is yours, sir. But
Thank you.
The issue today is Promesa and any other conspiracy tale in the sense of that we want to chase?
A point of
That's up
order.
to you.
Has
Yeah,
Mr.
my
Gomer
clock
yielded?
is still running as the chairman is eating up my time lecturing me in trying to cover up this matter. But let me ask you, Ms. Juresko, are you aware of Ukrainian parliamentarian Vilkova April 12th meetings with Liz Zentos and Eric Chiramella of the Obama National Security Council?
No, sir.
You were not aware of any meetings between them?
None, sir.
Okay. How did you go about becoming the Executive Director of Financial Oversight and Management Board of Puerto Rico? How did that come?
I was recruited by the members of the Oversight Board based on my experience as Minister of Finance in both the fiscal area and the debt restructuring that I did in Ukraine.
And that is the oversight, those were the people in Puerto Rico, correct?
The 7 bipartisan members of the Oversight Board, one of them is resident in Puerto Rico, yes.
Do you know who recommended you for that position?
It was a recruitment firm that was hired and a variety of candidates. I believe the Oversight Board was searching for almost a year, maybe 9 months. And it was at the recommendation of the board members that the board took that decision.
Yeah. To become director of, or the executive, well, I guess, director of finance in Ukraine, obviously you're American-born, you're American citizen.
Yes, sir.
Did you have to become a citizen of Ukraine in order to take that position?
Yes, sir. They awarded me citizenship the day I became minister.
The day you became minister?
Yes, sir.
How long had you been living there?
I lived in Ukraine from my initial posting in the U.S. State Department as the economics officer in 1992, and I left in 2017 when I accepted this position. So 25 years.
So you were there till you accepted this position in 2017, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And what did you do from April 2016 until you accepted this position and moved to Puerto Rico?
I took a break from my role as Minister of Finance during the war, and during the economic collapse of the country, which was very demanding. I did some public speaking, both here in the United States and in Europe.
Okay, so
Raised
you
my-
were,
and reacquainted myself with my children.
okay. So you were director of finance in Ukraine during the economic collapse.
I was Minister of Finance after the Revolution of Dignity. I became minister in December of 2014. Remember, the revolution there ended in February. Crimea was occupied illegally, and then eastern Ukraine was attacked.
Was attacked, you're talking about by Russia?
Yes, sir.
And that was with regard to the Crimea?
First Crimea, then eastern Ukraine after that. The war continues.
Okay, is that what you're attributing the economic crisis to?
It also was based on financial policies of past governments that led the country to be over-indebted, as well as to run very large and significant deficits.
Indebted like Puerto Rico, I guess. My time's expired.
Mr. Lowenthal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. As a former college professor, I have some questions myself about Ms. Juresko about what is occurring at the University of Puerto Rico. Ms. Juresko, you mentioned in your written testimony especially that the UPR, the University of Puerto Rico, is genuinely one of the best things Puerto Rico has to offer, and I probably agree with you in many ways, and that you mentioned also it's a source of pride for all Puerto Ricans. However, I'd like to ask you some things. In 2017, the university had a system-wide strike due to austerity measures, poor infrastructure, increased tuitions, but you also stated in your testimony that the fiscal plan calls for an increase in tuition and that the maximum, it will be annual tuition for fiscal year 2023 would be $5,090, and that all students you guarantee, basically, because of scholarships and others, that all students in Puerto Rico will be able to access education at this price. Are you really telling us that all students, you guaranteeing all students will be able to access the university with a median income of less than $20,000 in Puerto Rico, and that the scholarships will make this up for all students applying?
No, sir, not all students. What I was describing in my statement was that tuition has been raised to some level just under, $1,000 under the Pell Grant. So first of all, those who can apply for and achieve a Pell Grant can afford
Right.
tuition. Second, that we've set aside the equivalent of 12,000 full-time scholarships per year for those who may not qualify for a Pell Grant but are still needs-based. It is not about providing tuition for those who can afford tuition, who do not have a need.
And so you believe that will cover all the students at the university, either the Pell Grants or the scholarships, so the tuition increases will not impact students?
That's correct. They should have access to needs-based scholarships if the Pell Grant is unavailable to them.
Okay, the other question, thank you, and I hope that's so. I'm just not sure, and you're saying that student debt will not increase because of this?
Again, I can't speak to student debt. The university has to determine what the elements of the needs-based test will be, and I don't know whether other students will continue to take debt that perhaps wouldn't qualify for that.
I'd be interested in knowing how this is going to impact student debt. Not just because of Puerto Rico. That's a crisis throughout the nation, student debt. And
We will
I'm just
follow up,
wondering how, with what's going on in Puerto Rico, if you could at some point tell the committee, how
Yes.
is that going to impact student debt that's going on? Because I agree with you, it is the hope and the pride of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. The other question I want to ask you is that you mentioned about the looming pension crisis at UPR. Can you explain that?
Yes, unfortunately, although the University of Puerto Rico retirement system is better funded than the employee retirement system of the Commonwealth, which was funded at practically zero, the fact of the matter is that at the current level of funding that the university is currently providing, it will become bankrupt within the next 10 years. And so today what we see is a funding of approximately $60 million per year when the requirement identified by actuaries is almost twice that. What we've suggested in our fiscal plan is that the university do one of three things: either fully fund what is necessary, and or take on some pension reform aspects to reduce the amount that's necessary actuarially, but in no cases to underfund and lead to the same situation that we find ourselves in at the Commonwealth, to learn from the lessons that we've.
And where is the university, the administration, in terms of these recommendations?
It is my understanding that they have begun to work specifically on one of those options.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Bishop?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like many people, I'm not crazy to be here. That's why so very few people. Oh, good hell. Does this one work?
What's he bitching about now?
All right, that's 10 seconds of my life I'll never get back. Like many people, we're actually not here for us. We're here to talk to you and to those who are out there. So, Natalie, first, you've taken a couple of infamous shots here today. Let me apologize for that situation, and thank you for what you are both doing. A lot of the things that have been charged to this panel are really the things that the second and third panel here charged to them, but those are elected officials, so it comes with the territory, unfortunately. It's not the way things ought to be. So, since today is an important day, far more important than this hearing, this is the first day of the World Series. And I know this is more important to you, and if you don't, then ask the Alomar family, the Cepedas, Rodriguez, Clementi's relatives. They will say that that is more important. When one starts Little League, home plate is 17 inches. And when you get to high school, it's still 17 inches. And the minors, it's 17 inches. And in the majors, it's still 17 inches. And the pitchers are expected to hit those 17 inches. And even a major league pitcher that can't hit the 17 inches is basically sent to Pocatello afterwards. One of the things that never happens in any of those levels is to say, okay, if you can't do the 17 inches, let's make it 18 or 20 25 inches. We'll change the plate so that you can actually do the job. The draft that is floating around here is one of those things that's trying to change home plate. And it doesn't have to be. Keep home plate the same and just do the proper and appropriate things. Let's face it, the problems that Puerto Rico is facing right now, that the island is facing, has simply come from a lot of bad decisions that were made in past governments. Not all. There were some great governors and some great governments that tried definitely to institute those reforms, but they happened. The Promesa legislation was unique in the annals of Congress. Our committee was assigned to try and come up with something. We based it on a process that has historical precedence of effectiveness. If anyone thinks working with the Obama administration Treasury Department is an easy practice, I've got some other property, some oceanfront property in Phoenix to sell you. It just simply does not happen. But this was one of the bills that ironically had a majority of the House Republicans and a majority of the House Democrats in passing it. Even Mr. Grijalva said some nice things like it was necessary, and as a compromise it was workable. And the irony that the Senate didn't change a single word that is unique for the senators who still think they are paid by the word in the first place. Changing it is not going to solve the issue at hand. It's like trying to expand home plate. It simply won't be there. You have the tools that are there. What you need is to make sure you hit home plate. And that requires a government that's willing to work with the board on this temporary procedure to solve the problems. I am proud of the current governor. She is doing, I think, a remarkable job, as she said, in my office, and promised to solve these issues by working with the board. And I'm proud of the board trying to now work with the governor. And if we go forward with that, then actually you can accomplish something that is positive. This entire process is always intended to be temporary. And this entire process has three goals, at least in my mind. One is to provide economic success to an island that has potential. Not a lot of resources, but you got potential. The second is to provide governmental stability, which hasn't happened necessarily in the last several years, but can happen in the future if the board, as well as the governor's office and the rest of the political appointees, actually are working together. And finally, for me, it's an avenue, a pathway to statehood, which for me is still the important process at the end of the day. Without this board, without the structure we have in hand, those three goals, the economic success, the governmental stability, as well as the path to statehood, are going to be significantly retarded, if not eliminated. So that's why I'm proud of what you are attempting to do, and I'm proud that the new governor is attempting to work very closely to actually solve problems instead of creating problems. And that some of the draft that's been thrown out there can be situated as nothing short of political pandering to special interest groups. And the other bottom line about why this hearing and the next hearing is so significant is any of the proposals that have been floating out there aren't going anywhere. The idea that they'll be passed in the Senate or signed by a president is delusional at best. You have home plate. Use it. Satchel Paige once said, home plate don't move, just throw strikes. Throw strikes. I've got actually no time left over. Mr. Grijalva, you are more generous to me than I would have been to me. Would you please gavel me down? But at least I said something intelligent.
I'm sorry, Mr.
I saw my mic on, so be
Mr.
careful.
Bishop, it's a character flaw of mine of being respectful.
If you say of your elders, I'm going to go on for another 3 minutes.
Let me, Ms. Velasquez, you recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Marrero, I gather from your testimony that you are open to supporting a federal monitor coordinator. Is that true? Is that the case?
More than the name, I think that is what we need is to expedite the recovery funds. So if we can have someone to coordinate at the federal level, that will be more efficient, that will help the people of Puerto Rico.
So you think that adding another layer to what is already in place will facilitate accessing federal money?
I don't see it as additional layer.
Yeah, I hear you. So last week, I don't know if you are aware that last week, before the Appropriations Subcommittee, the administration testified that intentionally they missed a legally required deadline that would have made congressionally appropriated funds available to Puerto Rico. And we're talking about HUD and CDBG-DR. Are you aware of that?
Fortunately,
So
I am
is
aware.
the issue is adding another layer, or the issue is dealing with the fact that this administration has put roadblock on top of roadblock to make it difficult for Puerto Rico to access that money? Is that has been the history of the disaster relief package that we passed. 17 localities that were affected by Maria Harvey, all of them got their money, right? And yet, Puerto Rico didn't. I just came back from a Financial Services Committee hearing where I questioned Secretary Carson on that respect. So I don't believe that adding another layer will address the issue of the contempt of the administration to make it difficult for the government of Puerto Rico to access the money that we appropriated. In fact, I consider that to be a violation of the law. And people love to talk and lecture us about accountability of the government of Puerto Rico, but we don't talk about accountability of the federal government. And people use corruption, but no one mentioned here that 2 federal officials were arrested in Puerto Rico 3 or 4 weeks ago. So I don't believe that adding another layer will resolve what is at the crossroad here in terms of facilitating the money that was appropriated. No one, no agency is empowered to unilaterally withhold CDBG-DR funds. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about accountability. So, Ms. Jaresco, according to the board's own documents, federal delays could reduce the amount of money reaching Puerto Rico by $30 billion. Given that this federal aid is not coming in and the economy is not growing, the people of Puerto Rico continue to suffer. Can you assure the people of Puerto Rico that any additional belt tightening will not put on their backs, will not be put on their backs?
The document that you referred to, Congresswoman, was simply something that we were discussing with creditors as downside risks. We are still confident that Puerto Rico will receive the monies that it expects.
I hear you. You are confident that Puerto Rico is going to get the money?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, here we are. How many years later after Maria? So what is your plan B if Puerto Rico doesn't get the money? What is your plan B?
So with regard to the plan of adjustment, it would not affect it. We've limited debt service to $1.5 billion per year, which is less than 10% of own source revenues this year, regardless of any future receipt or future growth in the economy. It would be terribly unfortunate, and we will do everything in our power to work with the government and with you to assure
I
that
hear
they
you.
get the funds.
But you know what, Ms. Jaresco? The plan of adjustment is viewed by many as very generous to bondholders. It will be unacceptable for you to force more austerity on the people due to the administration's willful withholding of funds. Ms. Jaresco, in a motion submitted to the court, it is alleged that Dolphin Phelps, one of your many contractors, has overcharged the board and in turn the people of Puerto Rico. So we want to discuss accountability. Let's discuss accountability. How are you going to make sure that the people of Puerto Rico are not overbilled by your hundreds of contractors and consultants?
That is a Title III expense, and it went through the fee examiner, and that fee examiner is responsible for doing exactly what they've done. We don't review those bills. Those bills are reviewed by the court and the fee examiner. And we are grateful for the fee examiner's work in doing that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms.
But you
Jaresco.
can get consultants that will charge much less for a trip from San Juan to New York City? 5,000?
I want to thank both of you. I appreciate it. And thank you for your testimony and for your response. There's other follow-up questions that we will direct to you and for responses to with more specificity in terms of coordinator question and other questions in terms of the question that Ms. Velasquez just came up with, that she asked, Ms. Jarko, having to do with delays in the federal funding being expeditiously coming in and the consequences of that the report alluded to, but we asked for some more specificity on it. With that, thank you very much, and let me
Thank you.
invite the next panel up.
Thank you.
That was nice of you to say something to the poor woman. That was unnecessary. I was going to.
You ready to say this?
So basically.
Let's go. Thank you, everybody. Let's continue on. I'd like to now thank and welcome panel 2. As part of our witness list, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Carmelo Rios, the Honorable Eduardo Batia Gatier, the Honorable Antonio El Soto Torres, and the Honorable Rafael Hernandez as part of our panel 2 witnesses. I also want to remind the witnesses that we do have 5-minute limits. You'll see the lights in front of you. As the light turns yellow, that means you start wrapping up your answers, and when it turns red, we ask you to please finish your answers. With that, the chair now recognizes, I apologize. The chair now recognizes our ranking member, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Pro Tem. Now, I just want to quickly thank the witnesses for being here and so not being rude. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon is the ranking member of the T&I committee, which is talking about the very issue you're talking about here, so she has gone to fulfill her duties over there. I'm going to sit in a few minutes and then we'll apologize for leaving later, and Mr. McClintock will be finishing up this panel. But we want to definitely I want you to understand that's why we're playing musical chairs here, as well as thanking you for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Bishop. I now recognize the Honorable Carmelo Rios, the Majority Leader, Senate of Puerto Rico, for his 5-minute testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ruben Gallego, Acting Chair, and thank you, Mr. Bishop, as well as Mr. Grijalva and our resident Commissioner Gonzalez. On behalf of the President of the Senate of Puerto Rico, Honorable Tomás Rivera Chats, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to share with the committee our thoughts regarding the proposed amendments to Promesa. During the Chairman's recent visit to Puerto Rico, Senator Rivera Chats made clear our position regarding the draft under consideration today. Promesa does not need to be amended. It needs to be repealed. After over 3 years since its enactment, Promesa, with its Financial Oversight Management Board, has failed to bring fiscal responsibility and access to capital markets to the territory of Puerto Rico. Instead, Promesa has exacerbated the economic situation on the island, putting a magnifying glass over 121 years of colonialism that are the real root of our problems. President Rivera Chats believes that you should use your jurisdictional power under Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution not to amend a failed law, but to enact the legislation that will do away with our second-class status as a colony and admit Puerto Rico as a state of the Union. Only then will Puerto Rico truly possess the tools and mechanisms necessary to solve the social and economic crisis. Nonetheless, we would like to thank the Chairman Grijalva and other members of Congress for recognizing that Promesa is not working and for proposing a fix to what it is, in our opinion, unfixable. With this total of $214 million in annual budget from the fiscal year 2017 to the current fiscal year, which includes a very lucrative salary, Promesa, it is an unfunded mandate that has proved to be costly to the 3.1 million Americans in Puerto Rico. I would like to point out to this committee that the annual salary of the Board Executive Director, Ms. Yaresco, is 50% more than the President of the United States and 3 times the Speaker's salary. In addition, through the January 2019, the Title III Court has approved $300 million in fees and expenses. In a letter addressed to various U.S. senators and dated October 7, 2019, the chairman of the board, Mr. Jose Carrion itself, referred to the cost of Puerto Rico Title III cases as exorbitant and tragic. The board completed autonomy to exercise its power without any control, supervision, and oversight or review from the democratically elected officials such as the governor of Puerto Rico or ourselves had led to decisions that have been detrimental to 3.1 million Americans in Puerto Rico. Yet, we remain without access to capital markets, an ongoing debt restructuring process that is costing the government of Puerto Rico hundreds of millions of dollars. Promesa has failed and threatened the economic stability of the island. The bill before us today contains amendments seeking to correct many of the flaws that have become so obvious during Promesa's implementation. However, the main reason for Promesa's failure is simple and not addressed by any of the amendments being considered today by this committee. Promesa does not address the root cause of the problem on the island. It is colonial status. The same colonial status that allowed Congress to establish a fiscal control board that violates the principles of our democracy. It is unbelievable that after 121 years living under the flag of the Star-Spangled Banner and 102 years of American citizenship, Puerto Ricans remain living in an island that cannot vote for its national election or elect a commander-in-chief, or have a full-fledged representation in Congress as a State of the Union. It is unbelievable that at the 21st century, the beacon of democracy for the rest of the world still has 3.1 million disenfranchised Americans that treats them as a second-class citizen. Rather than expanding full democratic rights to all the citizens, the United States of America has now chosen to curtail them by enacting a law that has proven to be flawed and ineffective. To blame our fiscal crisis solely on mismanagement on the local level is to turn a blind eye to the reality resulting from unequal and second-class treatment of the federal level. It is to ignore that Puerto Ricans, by simply buying a one-way ticket to the continental United States, attain other rights, responsibilities, and privileges denied to them while on the island. It is to ignore that the 3.1 million proud United States citizens living in Puerto Rico deserve the same quality of life that their brothers and sisters in the state. The only real permanent solution to the fiscal problem of Puerto Rico before this committee, in my opinion, is statehood. It is time to extend to the American citizens of Puerto Rico the equal treatment, rights, and respect they deserve and have earned through the 102 years of faithful service to this nation. Statehood is the only real option viable for the solutions of the Puerto Rico challenge today.
Thank you, Majority Leader. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Eduardo Batia Gauthier.
Thank you, Mr. Gallego, Mr. Chairman Gallego. Sounds good. Ranking Member Bishop and other members of the committee, thank you for having us here. I represent the Popular Democratic Party as the ranking member, or I'm sorry, the minority leader in the Senate of Puerto Rico, former President of the Senate. While Promesa succeeded in providing a fair and orderly yet imperfect debt restructuring process, the Oversight Board has effectively become a supra-political entity governing the people of Puerto Rico in a naked colonial mode, and that is wrong. Whatever happened to government of the people, by the people, and for the people? So any amendments that do not return the decision-making power to the people of Puerto Rico are nothing more than putting a Band-Aid in a bullet wound. Congress must acknowledge that it cannot continue to govern Puerto Rico indefinitely pursuant to the property clause of the Constitution. Property rights was the central legal underpinning during slavery. Slaves were property of their masters who could dispose of them as they pleased. The territorial clause gives Congress property rights over Puerto Rico, which it can manage and dispose of as it pleases? Really? As long as Congress uses and the Supreme Court interprets this clause unscrupulously, the people of Puerto Rico have become property by extension for all practical purposes. We are at the mercy of our masters, and that is wrong. Even the infamous racist insular cases recognize the fact that the territorial clause was not appropriate for Puerto Rico. It had too many people organized in a government with their own language and culture. At first, the insular cases were used to discriminate against us. Later, they were used to allow self-rule and economic development. We are going back to where we started, eliminating self-government to advance powerful economic interests, and that is shameful. In the 1900s, it was the sugar barons, and now it's Wall Street's hedge funds. Only because many in Congress continue to view Puerto Rico through this proprietary lens is that it was even conceivable to submit us to the supra-political entity that is the Oversight Board. The Oversight Board's authority must be limited to just prescribing achievable numerical targets for budgets and fiscal plans, period. Spending priorities and other public policy determinations would then be returned to us. Now, regarding certain amendments proposed. First, amending Section 201B, the Essential Services and Economic Growth section. The identified need for amendments defining essential services as spending priorities reiterates the Oversight Board's unrestrained power and displacement of the government of Puerto Rico's substantive policy-making functions. Such amendments would not be necessary if the government of Puerto Rico had not been stripped of these. The Oversight Board has created a parallel government structure led by expensive third-party consultants. As Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor recently noted, the Oversight Board has effectively become an entity that no one can control. If Congress takes seriously its responsibilities to support Puerto Rico's economic growth, then it is time for a broader program. Congress must enact a permanent fix to Puerto Rico's inequitable growth, healthcare financing structure, and pursue economic development policies tailored to Puerto Rico. Rethinking federal tax policy to encourage private sector investment-driven recovery is indispensable. Either Puerto Rico grows or it will be perpetually subjected to bankruptcy. Second, accountability, access to information and ethical requirements. I welcome amendments promoting access to information and incorporating disclosure provisions, but Congress must also address the absence of ethical legal requirements applicable to members of the board. Third, reconstruction and revitalization. I support the Reconstruction Coordinator provided its role is limited to that of a facilitator. The proposed amendments do not do that. Aid is not being received by Puerto Rico. People are still suffering. This is unacceptable. Your citizens, my citizens, deserve better. The Revitalization Coordinator for PREPA is different. It would be granted a power to control tantamount to a federal receivership, and as I previously testified, I am not in favor of that. Finally, Puerto Rico Public Credit Comprehensive Audit. I fully support a comprehensive audit of the public debt. As president of the Senate of Puerto Rico, we passed Act 97, 2015, which is almost identical to that now proposed. My position remains the same. All public debt must be audited, illegal debt rejected, and the rest restructured. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The Honorable, I now recognize the Honorable Antonio El Soto Torres.
Dear Chairman Gallego, members of committee, on behalf of the Puerto Rico House of Representatives and most important of our constituents, we thank you for the opportunity to express our comments regarding the amendments to the Promesa Act 2019. We would like to express our appreciation to your continuous effort by the members of this committee in the recovery process of Puerto Rico under Hurricane Maria and Irma, especially our Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez for her ongoing work for our beloved islands. Since 1898, Puerto Rico has been a territory of the United States. The creation of the board and the imposed rules established by Promesa can only be conceded and approved upon territories in accordance with the U.S. Constitution, not to any state of the Union. We need to remind Congress that Puerto Rico not only has rejected the territorial status, but favored statehood in most recent plebiscites held in both 2012 and 2017. None of these electoral events were contested or challenged in any court of law. On the contrary, they represented the will and the voice of the U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico who participated freely and voluntarily and demanded full integration of Puerto Rico with the United States. Let's also not forget that Section 402 of Promesa established that nothing in this act shall be interpreted to restrict Puerto Rico's right to determine its future political status, including by conducting the plebiscite as authorized by Public Law 113-76. We request Congress to act now. Today, Congress could be acting upon the full incorporation of Puerto Rico as a state instead of amending Promesa and the board imposed over the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico. In regards to the amendments to the Promesa Act 2019, we want to be clear that we will support any congressional bill that will benefit and contribute for the better quality of life of the U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico. We definitely support all actions like those in Section 345 of APA 2019 that can and will contribute to the well-being of the people of Puerto Rico. We also agree that there needs to be total transparency in governmental transactions, like expressed in Section 6. This is the least our people deserve. So we support disclosure of professional persons employed in order to submit any information and contracts through the Oversight Board. We also believe it is necessary to provide trust to our constituency. So all documents relating to the public debt of the government of Puerto Rico should be classified as a public document, as established in Section 7. We understand and believe that the government of Puerto Rico is headed in the right track to gain the trust of the market and investors. This administration, with the support of our local legislative leadership, hasn't hesitated to meet the financial obligations and to comply with federal and local laws. The new Section 9, as proposed in APA 2019, established a mechanism that allows for unsecured financial obligations to be discharged. In order for any discharge of an unsecured financial obligation to be feasible, the trust of the government of Puerto Rico or its entity can't be put in harm's way. It is necessary to have a balance of what is the public interest needs in order to provide a stable and economic atmosphere for investment. We have always supported comprehensive audit of Puerto Rico public debt in order to provide a clean and transparent process, but this audit has to be done in accordance to and with the endorsement of the federal government. After Hurricanes Irma and Maria, the government of Puerto Rico created the Central Office of Recovery and Reconstruction and Resiliency. Also, we approved Local Law 17/2019 that established the Energy Public Policy of Puerto Rico. In the proposed bill, Section 11 and Section 12 will overrule those two local laws. So there'll be a redundancy if it is approved at each state. The best way to provide justice to the island is not by amending Promesa, but by providing the necessary tools to fully incorporate Puerto Rico as a state of the Union. Nevertheless, we respectfully submit and enclose documents suggesting several additional amendments to APA 2019. Our suggestions are based on 3-year experience working with the board. There are issues in the preparation of the fiscal plans. There are issues in the budgeting process, as Congressman Gallego and San Nicolas mentioned, and also Darren Soto. So those should be areas of consideration for another amendment in the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize the Honorable Rafael Hernandez, the Minority Leader for the Puerto Rican House of Representatives.
Good morning, Chairman Gallegos, Ranking Member Bishop of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss these amendments to Promesa. Promesa is an imperfect solution to the frightening challenge Puerto Rico faced in 2016. No matter how many amendments we agree on today, we will never make it perfect. All of this could have been avoided as the Congress adopted for Puerto Rico a super Chapter 9 of the bankruptcy law. Why this is important? As the governor of Puerto Rico 3 years ago, representing himself in the bankruptcy court directly with his own lawyers, this costly and exhaustive litigation would have ended by now, and we wouldn't be here today. The Oversight Board is a distraction and has become a perfect political excuse for the local government to agree something with the board and then say something different to the public. The result, the government hides behind the board and it creates political, social, and economic instability in Puerto Rico. But here we are. Congress will not eliminate the board, which will be our preference, so we have to continue to work very hard to meet the conditions you impose on us to pave the way to the board to get out. To this end, I am fully committed. We applaud that the U.S. government assumed the responsibility of payment of all expenses of the board, although it's implied that the board will then have to comply with all the regulations in the use of federal funds required by the U.S. Treasury. Local administration has refused to define essential services for purely political reasons. My suggestion is that we should strive to agree a certain percentage of the total budget to be designed at a reasonable maximum amount that the government will be set aside for its budget. We can look at the last 10 years and see how much we spend on essential services, and as a percentage of the total expenditure, and agree on a number. The stronger criticism to Promesa has been that it did not provide for economic development, when we all know that the solution to our fiscal problem is to grow our economy. The proposed amendment to set a specific economic objective that the board should strive for, but is lack of metrics. If we don't set measures goals, little will be done. Since fiscal plans for the next few years were drafted based on the flow of funds for the reconstruction of Puerto Rico, I suggest that the Promesa order the board to draw plans based on a 5% GNP annual, sustain growth for 2023 on, and provide specifics on how to will be accomplished. What will happen after the reconstruction funds end? The board needs to sit down now with our government to identify the competitive advantage that Puerto Rico offers investors, and both lobby Congress to legislate those incentives that will attract the capital that is needed to grow the economy. Needless to say, Puerto Rico cannot plan ahead its economic future on uncertainty, such as the federal credit for foreign companies, the recently enacted tax reform of the U.S., the total dependence on concession from the federal government, none of which provide a permanent solution to our economic challenge. In complete agreement with your amendment calling to total transparency in relation to the contracting consultants, lawyers, and accountants by the board. Requiring access to information, auditing the debt, we also support this goal. In complete agreement with the elimination of the position of Infrastructure Coordinator, to this date, the board has not approved one single critical project, except a housing development that is embroiled in the serious controversies and an investigation by the local House of Representatives revealed that the then coordinator and his attorney exert undue pressure on certain House members, as denounced by the Speaker of the House. But the crucial needs for infrastructure investment, particularly after Hurricane Maria, ceased. Now more than ever, and we're glad that you are addressing this issue with the creation of the Reconstruction Coordinator. The real need right now is the oversight and effective coordination of the federal agency to accelerate the disbursement of millions of dollars already approved by Congress. I cannot support the appointment of the Chief Executive Officer of PREPA with extraordinary power that supersedes those of the existing management structure. We are handing over the committee specific language to improve those amendments. We used to consider it. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee.
I want to thank my colleagues, elected officials, for their testimony today. And let me recognize first Mr. Gallego for his questions and comments. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Questions are first for Senator Rios. Section 8 of the discussion draft would repeal Title V of Promesa, which was originally intended to designate and fast-track, quote-unquote, critical infrastructure projects. Can you expand on why you think repealing Title V of the Promesa is necessary? Are there better, more sustainable ways to encourage infrastructure improvement on the island?
Well, thank you for the question. As you know, if I was going to support something on the amendment section 5, which entitles, it attempts to define the economic growth status. I mean, so far, what we have has on Promesa and the Fiscal Oversight Board is a project that was worth $25 million, and the guy who was part of the board had to leave the island with a $325,000 salary, by the way, and only to show for in 2 years a $25 billion project where he had a conflict of interest. So to define economic growth, it is something that is needed because right now it's too broad. And coming back to an analogy that Congressman Bishop had about home plate and 17 inches, I mean, as you all know, I've been a baseball player all my life, and I'm part of the national team of Puerto Rico. I'm a pitcher. And you can throw all the strikes you can, but if you don't have an umpire that can call strikes on balls, then you don't have a game. So we've been throwing strikes for the last 3 years, and the umpire, which is the board, in my opinion, hasn't been calling them fairly. So when it comes to economic growth, when it comes to defining what is essential businesses to Puerto Rico and services, the board has his own playbook and his own set of rules that doesn't benefit the people of Puerto Rico. So economic growth, Section 5, to amend Section 201, approval of fiscal plans, it is a good attempt to put us on the right track to actually make something happen. Because after all, that's what I thought they were going to be doing when they visited and established themselves in the island. I hope I answered your question.
To go a little further, Section 3 of the discussion draft would authorize federal funding for the operations of the Fiscal Board, money that currently comes from Puerto Rico's budget. Can you briefly explain the consequences of the way the board is currently funded and why you think this change is necessary?
Well, as you know, as a member of Congress, and I know you voted against it, and we had this discussion before, and we had this discussion with Chairman Grijalva, actually even before the elections down in Arizona. Senator Batten was present at the time, and we talked about why the people of Puerto Rico has to be funding something that is an unmandated thing, because I don't know what it is up to today. I mean, it's called a board, but it's something that it doesn't act like a board. It's like something else. And it should be federalized. I mean, Natalie Yaresco shouldn't be earning $600,000 when it's people of Puerto Rico's money. I mean, she comes in and she's doing a lot of things for the police officers. What about the teachers, the retirees? What about medicals? What about services like health? I mean, those are part of it. And I'm pretty sure if the United States of America and the Treasury Department was overseeing the way that the board operates, Natalie Yaresco wouldn't be making $6,000. They wouldn't have 6 bodyguards to go around, and they'll be responsible for what they do, and they'll be transparent, something they don't do up today. I mean, they ask the government of Puerto Rico to be transparent, but when it comes to them, they are foggy. So, I mean, it needs to be there, it needs to be funded by the Department of Treasury, and it needs to be federal, in my opinion.
And then just last question. The discussion draft also includes several provisions aimed at improving the transparency, so you just kind of talked about this, of the board and those decisions. Can you expand on the need for transparency beyond what you just spoke in the implementation of Promesa?
Well, when they come to and they ask the people of Puerto Rico and the government of Puerto Rico to be transparent on all transactions. When we ask them to give us information, they don't have it. I mean, they changed their fiscal plan, their very own fiscal plan. They changed it 7 times, so they do make mistakes. How many? We don't know, because they don't communicate the 2 ways that it should be with the government of Puerto Rico. I mean, they ask us and they ask Representative Soto all the time for information on the budget. When we come to ask them about budget, it's not there. And so it goes both ways. I mean, it has to be, you can't ask for collaboration one way. It has to be, otherwise it'll be a dictatorship. And my point is, they're not transparent, and Congress needs to call them to action and call them to order, said, what are you guys doing? 3 years and 1 project of $25 million? And they cost $240 million and plus, and $200 million and $300 extra million that are on the Title III they got allowed to spend. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McClintock, recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, I'm very sympathetic to your opposition to Promesa. I opposed it when it was adopted. And the reason was because I think it strikes at the very core of the accountability, not only that elected officials owe to the voters, but that the voters owe to themselves to deal with the consequences of the votes they've cast and the elected officials they've put into office. I mean, one thing is certain in a democracy: you are always guaranteed to get the government you vote for. And if it turns out it's a government that's not to your liking, that's just nature's way of warning you need to be a little more careful about the votes you cast. There's something to be said for going away sadder but wiser. The central premise of Promesa implies that the people of Puerto Rico are not competent to govern themselves, and I reject that premise categorically. But there is no denying that Puerto Rico's fiscal mess is a direct result of the votes that Puerto Rican voters cast for the officials that they elected. And that question, I think, is also central to statehood. Until the people of Puerto Rico take responsibility for their votes, for the officials they have elected, and then set things right, how can they make a case for statehood? My question of each of the panelists very simply is this: what would Puerto Rico's legislature do differently than the Promesa board has done? And I'll go right down the list. Senator Rios.
Well, that's a great question. Coming back to the statehood issue, I mean, it's a civil rights issue. I mean, I'm just a U.S. citizen just like you are, elected to Congress, and elected to the Senate of Puerto Rico, just like the states. So calling me to be unequal and defend what they call now the insular cases, it'll be a mistake, in my opinion.
What would you do differently?
Of course. Now, coming back to what I will do different.
If I could narrow this down, because my time's limited.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so.
What is the most important thing that each of you would have seen the legislature do that differs from what the Promesa board has done?
Well, first of all, balance the budget. That's something, you have $10 billion, that's what I can spend. And we all know this in this table. Now, second of all thing is we need to pay our debts. And my government said from the get-go, we need to pay. Now, how much can we pay? That's a whole different question. I was listening to your point about the unsecured debt. I think we should pay them as well, because it will send a wrong message, in my opinion, for the future market. And we need to get back in the market. That's point blank. I mean, we need to get in the market, and it can be at a high interest rate. Right. So being said that, we are in a pickle. I mean, we owe people money, and we told them we were going to pay them money. And we have COFINA, and we have the GOs, and we had all these matters that really is a contract.
I agree with you completely, but I want to also extend the question to the other witnesses.
Sir, I thank you for your question. Let me just say this. Puerto Rico had an...
Most important thing that you would do that differs from...
Three things. Number one, Puerto Rico has to get economic growth. If we don't get jobs, if we don't get investment, we're screwed. And we need to move forward in that direction. Puerto Rico had a great investment mechanism through taxation codes, and they were stricken away by Congress. for no reason, no reason whatsoever. Number two,
Pardon me, stricken in Promesa or stricken in another?
no, stricken in the 1990s, Section 936.
Oh, of course, right, okay,
1996.
I know
Number
what you're
two,
talking
we approved a local bankruptcy law precisely because we could do it at home. We tried to do it at home, and it was stricken down by the U.S. Supreme Court. Number three, I created, with the help of my colleagues.
Yeah, but again, you adopted a constitution that specifically pledged the full faith and credit.
Yes.
The redemption of those bonds.
And
what you want to do is renounce that.
No, we don't want to renounce that, not at
Okay,
all.
well,
We
anyway,
want to create a restructuring mechanism. But
Representative, I'm sorry, I've got very limited time. Representative Soto Torres?
Yes, economic growth will be one of our priorities. Definitely, we just approved the new incentive code. We also approved a local legislation for capitalizing on an opportunity zones bill, included in the tax reform, federal tax reform. So those are two major
Let me
changes.
ask you one other question. What has Congress done that has impeded the economy of Puerto Rico? And I'll direct that to you, Representative Soto Torres.
What did Congress?
What is Congress? What things could we do in Congress?
Sir, the problem is certainty.
I'm sorry. Say, Mr. Hernandez.
Sir, the problem is certainty. How we can approve something in Puerto Rico that then you can change over here as a federal law? We don't have no certainty. We don't have no stability. That's why we have 7 tyrants right now governing Puerto Rico. We are changing the rules right now again. How are we going to have economic growth if somebody can come here, lobby something to change the status quo, the stability, the rule of law of the Puerto Rico? They even can change
So
our
basically, you're saying
constitution.
Promesa itself is an impediment to
Promesa
economic
itself
growth
and
of
these
the-
amendments too.
Thank you.
Soto?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we talked a lot about the complex history and how the federal government has been complicit in a lot of this debt being accrued. I know a lot of you know that history well. I did want to mention again the good work we're doing in healthcare, that we have bipartisan support both here and on the island, which is to finally treat Puerto Rico and all of our territories equal with regard to Medicaid. And then just this last week to help seniors in Puerto Rico with the low-income senior assistance for prescription drugs. So that area, we're getting a lot of progress even beyond this. And then we talked a little bit about the bankruptcy reform in 1983, knocking Puerto Rico out of the code, and now Promesa, this contorted law that we're now faced with. We're here to get your input. So first, and that's why we put out a draft rather than a bill so far. So first, how many of you support having the independent audit, just by a show of hands so we could get that one? Raise your hand if you support an independent audit. Okay, so we have consensus on that. How many of you support the current definition of essential public services? Raise your hand if you support that. The current definition of essential public services.
The one sorry, sir.
The ones included in the draft?
The one included in the draft.
Very concerned about the ethical issues. Some of the board members who did not want to conflict of interest. And now when board members leave the board, whenever that happens, we should have full disclosure. And I think it's an ethical issue. I think Congresswoman Velasquez has raised the issue, and I fully support her bill, and I fully support the disclosure which goes beyond the board, the kind of disclosure that goes into all the consultants. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to just cleaning out the debt, of course, I would love that. But what are the consequences? And I think that we should be careful when we decide that we are going to erase the debt. I am all for erasing the debt. Perhaps if it's down to zero, it would be great. The question, if it is federally mandated, what effect will it have in the future of Puerto Rico? I'm concerned about that.
Thank you, sir. Representative Soto and Representative Hernandez, thank you for your feedback on the provisions of this discussion draft. In the testimony, you agree with amendments calling for protecting essential services. I think one of you gentlemen said it should be more ample, and the people should have some, people of Puerto Rico should have a role in deciding what they are. The other one was ensuring transparency, avoiding conflict of interest by consultants, and a comprehensive audit of the debt. Are there any provisions that we did not include in the discussion draft, if this were to move forward, that you would recommend, both of you?
We included and sent to the committee a group of amendments in terms of the process for the preparation of the fiscal plan,
Okay.
in terms of the budgeting process, and establishing some parameters for the board. I'm going to give you a few examples. In the budget process, Promesa established that the legislatures, once approve a budget, it is sent to the oversight board, and they have to certify that it is in compliance with the fiscal plan, and that it could be significantly consistent with the fiscal plan. What is significant consistent with the fiscal plan?
If I may,
Sure.
Mr. Hernandez, a quick comment on any provision that, if we're going in that direction of reforming Reforma, what recommendation?
We include in amendment and consider enacting restrictions to avoid conflict of interest in the hiring of contractors by the board to defend self-interest as a member in the process of lobbying, in the process of reappointed. They are using resources of the people of Puerto Rico to lobby for himself.
Better call the last one.
One
Gentlemen,
last thing. All right.
they're going to call votes in 40 minutes or so, so I want to thank all of you for your testimony. Appreciate it very much. Very helpful. And at this point, let me ask, there is other questions for you that we're going to submit in writing that we didn't get a second round, but, I want to thank you again, and let me now call the next panel up, and thank you again. ¿Cómo se llama? Carmen Yulin. Almost. Let me now welcome the Honorable Carmen Yulin, Mayor, City of San Juan. Thank you, and thank you for your patience and for coming to visit us. Want to also, on a personal note, thank you very much for your insistence on a couple of points that are part of this, having to do with transparency issues within that, audit with the provisions, and the defining process. If Promesa is going to be reforming the defining process for what essential services were. Our visits with you in San Juan, those are points that you made very, very clearly to us, and so I appreciate that help. 5 minutes, floor is yours, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. The presence of a board comprised of non-elected officials making decisions on behalf of Puerto Rico constitutes a de facto financial dictatorship. Thus, Promesa must be repealed. The board continues to mortgage our future while acting on behalf of vulture funds. Our debt must be canceled. However, since the political will for that seems distant, it must be fully audited. Reaching payment agreements without this audit is simply catering to the needs of bondholders. We are satisfied an audit commission has been included in the draft. We suggest the committee revives the Comisión Ciudadana para la Auditoría de la Deuda as enacted by Puerto Rico's Law 97 approved in 2015. This would be a step towards restoring public trust and governmental accountability. Defined Section 201, La Junta neglected to craft their fiscal plan with sufficient funding for essential services. The board has strangled our limited budget to favor debt payment, disregarding the severe impact this would have on our people. The fiscal plan cannot be oblivious to governmental obligations to provide basic essential services. Our position is simple: the people before the debt. The draft before us is an opportunity to remedy this wrong by ensuring funding for essential services such as pension payments for governmental retirees, education services, health services, and law enforcement services. We submit that draft should also include, as essential services, municipal financing and transportation for the people of Vieques and Culebra. Financial recovery cannot come at the expense of neglecting to provide appropriate levels of essential services, for it is those who need these services the most who will bear the brunt of any austerity measures. The latest fiscal plan, which has been endorsed by Governor Vasquez, includes additional cuts to our pensions. These reductions will simply make it unbearable for many of our retirees to survive. Education is the strongest weapon against inequality and the true path to achieving social justice and economic growth. The first step is guaranteeing a future for our young people must be safeguarding our most important higher education system, the University of Puerto Rico and its 11 campuses. This committee needs to understand more fully that municipalities are the level of government closest to the people, responsible for providing its citizens with essential services. The board has already reduced $350 million in municipal funding for all municipalities, thus limiting their ability to provide essential services for our citizens. We urge you to include a disposition in the law to create an advisory committee composed of representatives from municipal governments aiming to ensure this level of government is part of the solution. The current draft includes two dispositions which we vehemently opposed. Sections 11 and 12 call for the creation of a Reconstruction Coordinator for Puerto Rico and a Revitalization Coordinator for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. Legal figures such as these would further undermine democratic structure of our local government. In the case of PREPA, we are concerned the proposed structure would concede incalculable authority to one person, essentially making this coordinator into super oversight board of one. Promesa is a clear manifestation of the burden of colonialism. I appreciate the positive steps taken by this committee in trying to ease the pains caused by the enactment of Promesa, but the truth remains. This can only happen because we are a colony. Until that is addressed, we will only be facing part of the problem. When thinking of Promesa, this committee must answer a fundamental question: con la Junta o con la gente, with the people or with the board? The answer must be clear and unequivocal. Puerto Ricans before the debt. The people of Puerto Rico must not be asked to sacrifice any more. God knows we have sacrificed more than enough. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Recognize my colleague, Mr. Soto, for any questions you may have, Madam Mayor. Mr. Soto?
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks, Mayor, for coming today. Wanted to get some follow-up. So you support the audit and having the full commission of different groups to be part of that, so you can get more community input into that audit. Is that correct?
I support the audit fully, and I would just revive a committee that was already implemented by the past legislature. Eduardo Batia talked about it, la Comisión Ciudadana para la Auditoría de la Deuda. This was had input from various agents in Puerto Rico, and it made it more transparent and more accountable to the people of Puerto Rico.
More accountable than a Promesa audit that didn't include a lot of those stakeholders, right?
Well, the problem with the members of the board is that some of the members of the boards were part of the problem. They were part of the process of ensuring that bondholders bought at prices that frankly were ridiculous, and now getting repayments or prices that are strangling the people of Puerto Rico. So when you begin with 7 people that are not mandated by the people of Puerto Rico, and on top of that, some of them were part of the problem that you're trying to fix, which again should be a problem fixed by the people of Puerto Rico, it becomes an issue.
And then, as Mayor San Juan, what kind of barriers did you face in drawing down federal funds and working with the Trump administration?
Well, it is no secret that President Trump and I don't see eye to eye. There is one thing that he said after the storm that we agree totally. He said he thought the entire debt of Puerto Rico should be repealed, should be eliminated, should be brought down to zero. That is the one thing and one thing only that I agree with President Trump. But we have not yet received, as none of the other municipalities, any monies from the CDBG-DR fund, number one. Number two, we are still waiting on FEMA to give us money from categories A, B, and Z. Some municipalities have not even been paid part of that. Mind you, for the people that are listening, those are the funds that we used in getting ready for the hurricane and in taking care of our citizens right after the hurricane. It is important to note that municipalities were the first level of support that people received and saw right after the hurricane. So taking $350 million away from municipalities for San Juan, that was $21 million less, in what is wrongfully called subsidies. It is not subsidies. It is something like municipalities earned $1. The central government took that dollar, gave 25 cents back, and now calls that a subsidy. So it's merely retribution for earnings that the municipalities had in the past and no longer have.
So a lot of us, including you and I and others, are concerned about having these two coordinators when we already have the federal board, fiscal board. So whether it's them or Core 3, or what do you think we should be doing to help speed up the funding, other than the obvious, which is we're holding these hearings to put pressure on the administration?
Well, this is an issue of political will. It's an issue of President Trump, first of all, not understanding what the relationship of a colony is to the United States, and secondly, frankly, not paying attention. He said to the people of Puerto Rico that the reason why help was not getting there, and this is a quote, because we are an island surrounded by water, lots and lots of water, ocean water. That was his excuse for not getting the help that the people of Puerto Rico needed. But the one thing is, number one, to put pressure. Number two, it's just to make sure that the monies that go do not go directly only to the central government of Puerto Rico, that it goes directly to the 78 municipalities, because it is the municipalities that know exactly what the people of their cities need and would support. In fact, we were asked, all of the mayors in Puerto Rico were asked to put forth a plan for CDBG-DR money, and the central government passed under Rosselló, and Wanda Vasquez has not mentioned anything to the sort. She talks about helping municipalities, but nothing has come through to ensure that the power really goes in the distribution of those funds to the municipalities. I've had conversations with the mayor of Houston, mayor of New York, mayor of Atlanta, and really this is an issue with mayors all over. This extra layer of FEMA and federal government suppression of funding going through the central governments rather than directly into the cities, it's a hindrance that really makes it really difficult to come back from a terrible, not one, two terrible disasters like Irma and Maria.
Thanks, Mayor, and I yield back.
Mr. McClintock, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think California and Puerto Rico share a lot in common. Ours are among the most beautiful and blessed parts of our country. Yet every year, more people move out of our state and more people move out of your Commonwealth than move in. My God, Puerto Rico is an island paradise. It's a cruise ship destination, for heaven's sake. People ought to be flocking to it and rather than fleeing from it. These aren't acts of God, these are acts of government. Lincoln once said that, the voters are everything. If the voters get their backsides too close to the fire, they'll just have to sit on the blisters a while. It's a painful experience, but it's a learning experience, and voters go away from that sadder but wiser. And I think the best thing that we could do for Puerto Rico is get rid of Promesa, let the elected officials make these decisions, and allow the voters of Puerto Rico to live with those decisions for better or for worse. I think before Promesa, voters were coming to these decisions. They were voting to change the government until Promesa relieved them of this responsibility. What are your observations on this?
Well, first of all, let me tell you, I happened to go to California for the first time this year. And we share a lot of things, except California is a state of the United States. That is your country. Puerto Rico is my country. We don't see, I am a citizen of the United States, but I am a Puerto Rican national. And that makes a difference in the way that we see things
if
eye
I
to
could
eye.
interrupt, it doesn't make a difference on your sovereign debt. California and Puerto Rico both assumed the responsibility of sovereign debt, and both in their constitutions pledged their full faith and credit to that debt. Your philosophy is people before debt, but it's the credit worthiness of a government that's that government's lifeline. It's what makes it possible to respond to emergencies and to finance infrastructure over the life of that infrastructure. The irresponsible issuance of debt to pay ongoing expenses or to pay for pension obligations is the fastest way to bankrupt a government and to destroy its credit worthiness. And that's not an argument for statehood. If that's what you're arguing, it's an argument for separation and independence.
I don't argue with statehood, sir, but let me tell you something. Governments make decisions. I agree with you. When the government of the United States decided to bail out Wall Street, that was a decision.
And by the way, a bad one.
Well, you think it was a bad one. So it is time to bail out the people of Puerto Rico.
Well, again, that's not an argument for statehood.
I know
That's an
we
argument
don't.
against
I know
statehood.
I know you're against it.
Let me ask you the same question I posed to the legislators. What would you do differently from Promesa, other than renouncing your sovereign debt and destroying the credit worthiness, completely destroy the credit worthiness of the government? What would you do differently from Promesa?
One thing would be economic growth. We cannot have economic growth if we cannot control our economic variables.
Okay, for example.
For example, we have to have a conversation with our brothers and sisters from the Longshoremen's Union to begin repealing the Jones Act.
Amen to that.
Which makes it very difficult for Puerto
Sign me
Rico.
up for that. What other
That is
acts
number
of
one.
Congress
Number
have acted
two-
as an impediment to your economic?
Number two, Puerto Rico should be able to draw its own bankruptcy laws. It was in Chapter 9. In fact, I was in front of this committee supporting a bill by the then resident commissioner, Pedro Pierluisi, to enact that same legislation.
If I could interrupt you right
Yes.
there, no state has renounced its sovereign debt. You would be suggesting that Puerto Rico should be admitted with a record of simply dishonoring its
Sir, I
sovereign
do
debt.
not favor statehood. I favor a process of a constitutional assembly for all the voices of Puerto Rico to be heard, similar to the one that you went through, and for Puerto Ricans to decide what their relationship with the United States would be. So I do not, please, voy a pedir la vuelta. It's an expression in Spanish. I am not in support of Puerto Rico becoming a state, which is why I mentioned to you before, I am a Puerto Rican national who holds a U.S.
I
citizenship.
get that, but anything else that you can tell Congress right now that it needs to do to get out of the way of Puerto Rico's ability to grow its economy?
100% Medicare and Medicaid parity. If we pay the same thing, we should get the same benefits.
Well, you want bailouts, I get that part, but
No, it's not a bailout. Say we pay the same thing, we should get the same thing. That is what the American dream is predicated upon, right? You work hard, you pay what you owe, and we have paid for Medicare and Medicaid. Again, we don't control our economic variables, so we should not be responsible. You invaded Puerto Rico, you put boots on the ground. You tried Agent Oranges. You tried Agent Orange in our forest. You tried the pill with our women.
I get that.
It is retribution.
I get that. My time's up, but I do want to invite you and the legislators who testified before you, any thoughts you have on what Congress can do to remove the impediments, the obstacles that we have placed in the way of Puerto Rico's economic growth, like repealing the Jones Act, which I agree with you completely. I'd like to hear.
Well, thank you, Mr. McClintock.
Madam Mayor, in your testimony and in both written and oral, you crystallized the dilemma, I think, for Congress, and certainly for myself, is how do you thread the needle in terms of providing the essential support that our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico have earned and merit, not only in the fiscal issue, but also in the recovery issue, and doing so with the instrument that's before us, which has been categorized and accurately as undemocratic, Promesa. So how do you thread that needle? So the discussion in the draft is how do you reform it to make it less onerous, potentially more democratic, and expedite the resources. Because we've heard today from the ranking member that this is a process in terms of status change. It's going to take minimum 5, 6, 7 years, given the timetable that was presented by the director of the Oversight Board and by the elected representative that spoke as well. So my point is that can that needle be threaded, you know?
Yes, it can. One is by ensuring that full funding for essential services, and I agree with Senator Batia when he says the people of Puerto Rico should be the ones deciding what the essential services are. But there is a general consensus that pension payments should not be reduced anymore. Number one. Number two, the University of Puerto Rico, and I know that the proposed bill suggests an $800 million allocation of resources to the University of Puerto Rico. But we must ensure that all the 11 campuses are kept open. They're not only a source of education, but they're a source of income for different municipalities. Number three, Section 936 of the IRS Code should be reinstated. Why? Because it provides for Puerto Ricans to have economic growth. Number four, we should be allowed, and this goes to a different, what Mr. McClintock was talking about, but we should be allowed also to enter into international agreements with other countries. And the terms of that could be discussed with the United States. Number four, it is imperative and important that our people that pay the same for certain benefits receive the same benefits in terms of Medicaid and Medicare. Of course, you know I'm a supporter of Medicare for all, and that would be something that would be important to pass in terms of legislation. But this is the truth. It is true that the Constitution of Puerto Rico states that the debt goes before the people. But as we all know, constitutions evolve. And our Constitution, frankly, also we need to change it to ensure that that needle that you're talking about is finally a thread. But 120,000 people still live with blue tarps. Eduardo was talking about 50,000 homes. 1.3 million Puerto Ricans need some type of help to put food on the table. 900,000 Puerto Ricans are either under insured or not insured at all. So if we do not take care of essential services and fund them, we are going to condemn the people of Puerto Rico to even more dire levels of poverty. That is simply unacceptable to us, and frankly, it is unacceptable to you as well.
Yeah, and the, I think, implicit threat, I'll use the word threat or observation on the part of, to some extent, the governor and the board, oversight board, was that in defining a provision of essential services, that the unintended consequence is that, or circumstance, that other government services that are not enumerated or defined, and I agree with you, the idea of the concept of the people on the island should decide what those priorities are, that are deemed not essential, you're therefore would receive the essential cuts. It's kind of an implicit threat if something's going to give, and obviously that's some work ahead for us if this is a provision that there is some support for going forward. So I appreciate that. The other thing you mentioned, and all of us have, members of this committee, many have visited Puerto Rico and taken the time to meet with elected officials and others. On the visits that I've had, it's been, to me, one of the most eye-opening was meeting with the municipalities and their leadership. meeting with the comunidades de base, the community organizations that are there, eye-opening in terms of how they feel kind of left out of this process, that it's done at a central level in Puerto Rico government, and then it's done at a federal level, and no transparency. And some of the things about building confidence was directed at those municipal areas and those leadership and those community organizations where the audit, the transparency, the known conflict was to provide those groups some assurances that what is intended is actually going to happen. So
This is why we are suggesting to have an advisory committee at the municipal level, so that you can include NGOs also there, so that you could have that ear on the ground, because in fact, it is the municipal level that is closest to the people of Puerto Rico and providing those services. One last thing, Mr. McClintock mentioned President Lincoln. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Well, we're not going to consent anymore.
thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate all the witnesses, Madam Mayor, the representatives, the senators, and the representative of the governor, and the representative of the Oversight Board. Before I leave, I just want to just some observations, if I may. We heard today about repeal Promesa, and essentially let the democratic institutions within Puerto Rico deal with the issue and begin to formulate the response, not only to the fiscal, but also what the federal government needs to do, because a repeal is a gesture without the substantive support that is merited in terms financially and with resources from the federal government is an exercise that will just create more pain. But I understand that was one of the options. The other options is status quo. Promesa's fine, leave it alone, let it keep working its way, and eventually they'll disappear because everything will be balanced and things will be fine. And the other issue is the one dealing with the reform choices.
Are we going to another panel or another round of questions?
No, I'm just finishing up, sir. You're welcome to leave.
On whose time? I'm quite sure I am. I wonder on whose time is the chairman speaking?
Assuming a prerogative, sir. The choices that we placed in this were reform, upgrade, try to make more democratic the existing Promesa legislation. That's the task that we have at hand, and it's a difficult task to say the least, given today. I want to thank you all. I appreciate it, and going forward, we will be in consultation with all of you. Meeting adjourned.